that those scenarios that were put together at the time did provoke a lot of talks and a lot of thoughts, discussions and conversations that ultimately led to solutions involving a lot of people, and they all coalesced towards finding a common solution. Scenarios always play a vital part and start imagining a better future, a better and a bright society that is certainly better than today. It is against this background that few people, both from civil society, academics and business people, they all came together and agreed that once more, as it has been in the past, as it has been before, to start developing new scenarios for South Africa. This was premised on the need to reimagine South Africa. It was a wonderful moment to be part of that team back in 2016 and 2017 that started this project to reawaken our sense of dreaming, our sense of purpose, reflection and direction. It really gives us a lot of pride and love that has been demonstrated by those people, some of which are present today, that have enabled us to pause for a moment and remember the country that we have all dreamed for, that it is because of the vision and the deep sense of imagination that has helped us to lift our gaze and not be confined by factors and circumstances that are around us, nor are we going to be allowed by the similar factors to define what we are to become. This journey also helps us to free our spirits, our minds, and liberate ourselves from our mindsets, and to allow for a breakthrough thinking by refusing to be shackled by our past or our history, and work together and collectively to create a better future. So we started the work formally in June 2017, and after an elaborate consultation period that took about a year, everyone that we spoke to agreed and supported the need to dream again and unleash the spirit of creativity and innovation. And we took it upon ourselves to assemble the relevant people that were involved in the scenario work, which my colleagues will share with you later. It is this work that was formally launched in Kyalami on the 21st of June 2018 by the President of the Republic of South Africa, President Cyril Ramaphosa, that we would like to share with you. This work is being led by Professor Somadoda Fikeni. It's called Indlulamthi Scenarios. The word Indlulamthi is a Nguni word for a giraffe. A giraffe is an animal that looks above the trees. We've chosen this name because it directly translates to what we would like to do with the scenarios. One of the key questions that these scenarios seek to ask and answer is, what would a socially cohesive South Africa look like? And to what degree is it attainable by 2030? I'm now going to hand over to my team to share more about this question. Thank you very much.
Great. Perfect. So I'm going to take you through a little bit of the work that we've done and some of our key findings, some of the storylines that have been at the center of our scenarios, and then hand over to my colleague Vuma to speak through our final scenario and then kind of the way forward for this project. So as Andile mentioned, we were led by a key guiding question in a lot of different contexts. It's not just about hugging after the rugby game or we all feel lovingly towards one another. We are mobilizing a definition of social cohesion that is much more oriented towards questions of justice, integration, more inclusive. So for this project and a kind of sounding board for our ideas, we have the steering committee, and all three of us sit on that committee who drive the project management side of the knowledge that we could garner from a spread of South Africans that would really draw on their imaginative and creative impulses and their deep-seated concerns. So we opted for a qualitative approach to the research and worked with about 150 participants. And so initially the kind of representative spread was focused on sectors, and we wanted to make sure we had a distribution of people across government, civil society, labor, faith-based organizations, and so on. But we began to notice that those sectoral leaders, while being excellent experts in their field, were tending towards an older demographic, and we were also leaning towards a more male demographic, and of course it was vital that we corrected that. And so we began to do a number of things. First, we ran a focus group with young people, job-seeking youth in particular, who we connected with through Harambee, who's an organization that links young people to potential employers. And with those young people, we used a similar model to what we had used in our interviews, but in a focus group setting. The same kinds of questions with some creative work, poster making, and so on. We also had a focus group that was allowing us to reach young people across the country, even though we were based in Gauteng. And that online platform meant that young people could be giving their insights, their worries, their concerns from the comfort of their own home without us having to traverse the country. And then finally, we had workshops and briefings. So that meant we were regularly coming back to our core participants, and we were telling them what was emerging to the young people who we also drew into that room, giving them a sense of what was coming up and what were the gaps that we needed to be addressing. Were there things we were leaving out? Was this resonating with them? And so you'll see in that final section of this slide that there are a number of themes that emerged as areas where we felt like we needed to garner more information, where this was emerging as a significant theme, but we felt that we needed to know more about it, or we felt there was a gap in existing knowledge. And so some of those questions there that you see there were addressed at our research conference, which we had in March of this year. And that research conference drew in experts from across the country to tell us the state of the evidence on these key questions. And you'll see that they are very broad-ranging. They deal with everything from land reform to questions around human trafficking, which emerged very strongly from our job-seeking youth in particular, to the structure of the South African economy. And all of these were themes that our participants felt would have a strong impact on social cohesion between now and 2030. The other excellent thing about the research conference is that it allowed us to move from our 150 sample of really rich engagements with participants to a much broader happening across the country. The next part of the process required that we take all this data that we had gathered through interviews, focus groups, online platforms, workshops, briefings, the research conference, and we distill it into 25 of what we call variables, and that's a term that's flung around in a lot of different disciplines. But for the purpose of our exercise, what variables are hypotheses about the future. They're not predictions by any means. They haven't been modeled statistically, although we will be doing a modeling exercise later on in this project. What they are the kind of intuitions and hunches of our participants that have been informed in some way by the existing evidence. Some of them have a high degree of certainty attached to them, so we know quite well, for example, the trajectory of climate change, we know quite well the trajectory of demographics in the country, but there are other things here like labor absorption, the future of youth employment, state capacity and so on, that have a lot more uncertainty attached to them. So what we then do is we ask our participants, and this is a very confusing slide, but what's important here is the kind of lines of these quadrants, but we ask our participants to tell us which of these trends do you feel we can have a high degree of certainty about, and which of these trends are going to have the highest impact on social cohesion. And then the most uncertain and most impactful of those variables or trends become the meat that we begin to work with for our storylines. And that's because, of course, if a variable is uncertain, it means it could go this direction or that direction or another direction. And if that's the case, then it helps us paint different possibilities for the future. So once we have that quadrant of variables, what we then wanted to do was to look at what was falling in that quadrant and to bring those variables together into what we call 3 key driving forces. And those would be the key driving forces that we believed would shape the trajectory of social cohesion in the country. And these were what we ended up coming up with, and I will speak very briefly to each of them. The first is social inequality. And here we wanted to capture a huge number of questions that circulate around inequality. The first are the obvious material questions that often come to mind. So we know that South Africa has horrifically stark income inequality, terrible wage gaps, but our participants were also very strong on the fact that asset inequality is crucial to what is driving the nature of inequality in the country. So that's land, property, wealth, inheritance, and so on. Then, of course, there are questions of access, and here what came up was a lot of spatial questions. So people wanted to make clear that when you're on the outskirts of the city or in a more rural area, your access to public space, public services, the economy is radically reduced. So there are important spatial questions about apartheid spatial planning, colonial spatial planning, and so on. The other access questions are, of course, access to education, access to health, and there, it's come up already this morning, ECD featured very strongly. So our participants were very clear in telling us that actually within the first 1,000 days of a child's life in this country, they can be set on a certain trajectory that then determines the future of inequality, whether it's around nutrition or early stimulus or parenting relationships and so on. And then finally, the inequality question deals with some of the immaterial aspects of how inequality operates in this country. And by immaterial, I'm talking about the kind of non-structural things, but the social questions, particularly around networks. So many of our job-seeking youth were very clear to tell us that the reason I don't have a job is not just because I don't have the right skills or I'm not living in the right area, it's because I don't know the right people. And this bears out very strongly in a lot of the existing sociological research, which tells us that if I have someone employed in my family, I'm much more likely to get a job than someone who has no one employed in their family or in their friendship groups. And we could talk about that a lot. So that's social inequality. Institutional capacity has come out very strongly today, and of course here there were a lot of themes around questions of capacity in the state, and that has to do, of course, with ethics, corruption, mismanagement, but also with the weakness of our bureaucracy and our civil service, which came up a lot, worries about procurement and recruitment practices. But this institutional capacity question was not just a state question. People were also concerned about the institutional capacity in the private sector and in civil society. They felt disappointed by unethical and lack of transparency within the private sector. And similarly, they felt that given these circumstances, it was even more important that civil society was robust and that we had a sense of active citizenship. Of course, institutional capacity also means our ability to plan long-term, to implement policy, to be able to think in ways that don't have these 5-year cycles that we're so familiar with in South Africa. And then finally, the triple R, what we refer to often as the triple R, which deals with questions around reconciliation, resentment, and resistance. What this is intended to capture is all the things that came up from our participants around the incomplete democratic transition. And we've spoken a lot this morning about a lack of structural and socioeconomic redress, and of course that came out very strongly, that we have not seen enough of that, that in many structural ways the country looks the same. But there were also the more kind of difficult interpersonal questions around how we have conversations about reconciliation. And many felt that we didn't have a basis from which to work in that respect, that there was a lot of unspoken non-agreements between us that were making it less possible for us to have honest conversation. We were too afraid to rock the boat. And so we didn't have a common understanding of our past, we didn't have a common understanding of who had or had not benefited from the transition, and that was making it very difficult to have meaningful conversations about reconciliation. And so, of course, if people feel like the project of reconciliation hasn't happened, resentment and resistance bubble up in various forms, whether it's around race, language, land, and other forms of alienation. In fact, and I often make this point, if there's anything that united our participants in their perspectives, and they were very varied, people felt a shared sense of alienation, no matter where they were located in the kind of South African social space. So I'm now going to lead you through where this took us. So we had these three driving forces, and those become the creative material through which our storylines were devised. And we have come up with 3 scenarios for South Africa's future in 2030. And just to emphasize before we take you through them, and I'm going to do a very brief synopsis here, these are not predictions of the future in any way. They're not telling you what the future will be like in any scientific way at all. They're intended to be tools for strategic thinking and planning, possible directions the future could go based on what we've been discussing with our participants and the research that we have gathered. And they're intended to kind of spark debate and spark really long-term thinking in a way that we haven't had for quite some time, or at least our participants feel we haven't had for quite some time. So the first scenario we've titled East Bourgeois, and you'll notice that all our scenarios are named after dance styles in the country, and we'll explain why that is. East Bourgeois is another word for bourgeoisie, and the reason for that is that this society is characterized by South Africa becoming increasingly enclaved. So you have the bourgeoisie, the wealthy, retreating to their enclaves. We often refer to this as a kind of stain city scenario, where people live increasingly in gated communities, accessing private healthcare, private education, private security, private entertainment. In fact, in this scenario, we imagine South Africa having the highest number of privately employed security guards in the country, in the world, of course in the country, in the world. So within the enclaves, life is fairly comfortable, and people are withdrawing more and more from public space, even to the point that people have moved off the grid, privately supplied water, privately supplied electricity, and so on. But outside of those walls, you still have the majority of the population really struggling economically and struggling to survive. And of course that means resentment, protest, and mobilization around a lot of the current resentments of the present. So that means mobilization around race, around ethnicity, around gender, around all the flaring questions that determine people's marginalization. But despite all of this kind of unhappiness amongst the poor and their exclusion from wealthy enclaves, we also see self-sufficiency in this scenario. So we already know from across the country that in many of our townships and rural areas, for example, people start their own creches, or they start their own small businesses. And in this scenario, we imagine that some of those creches will even start to outperform government services. And that's because a key driver here is that institutional capacity in the East Bourgeois scenario is incredibly weak. And where institutional capacity in the state is weak, the private sector has stepped in and started to run the game. And of course, run the game to the benefit of a privileged few. And that becomes the kind of key driver for fragmentation and massive inequality within an East Bourgeois scenario. And I want to talk you through our second scenario, which is we've titled Nayele Walk, and that's because it's about a nation being in step with itself, everyone getting on board and into the project of national reconciliation and nation building. And the impetus for this is that in scenario 2, we see people really taking accountability seriously. So there are public kind of show trials of key officials who've been found guilty of corruption. We see a promotion moratorium on people who've overseen unclean audits. And for the first time in a while, the public starts to feel as though the government is working for them. And that inspires a sense of public participation from across civil society organizations and also within schools. So 2 key drivers of what is moving positive change in this scenario are firstly that the government invests very heavily in early childhood development, and secondly that we see much more collaboration between the Department of Arts and Culture and the Department of Basic Development, so that we mobilize the arts much more in basic education and as a tool for building a sense of national identity, for kind of sharing of language, of culture, of story. That becomes a key part to a more meaningful conversation around reconciliation. From a kind of industrial perspective, and I didn't mention in the first scenario, but in the first scenario, unsurprisingly, given the fragmentation and the privatization, we see a struggling union movement, and we see struggles in big sites of the industrial economy. In the second scenario, Nayele Walk, there is much more improved industrialization with a focus on light manufacturing in particular. And so that drives significant economic gains. We also see technology taking on an important role for good and bad in all three of the scenarios, in fact. So in some way, generating increased connectivity and opportunity, and in other ways resulting in more casualization and insecurity of workers. So what I'm going to do now is hand over quickly to Vuma, who will take you through our final scenario and then the next steps of the project. And I know we don't have a lot of time, but what I do want to stress is that these are all very detailed scenarios, and you all have in your conference bags the Ndlula Miti booklet that gives a very long description of what's going on in each of these.
Thank you, Dr. Vale. So I just want you to live through this scenario that I'm going to present to you. So I just want you to close your eyes for a second. Just imagine yourself waking up in the morning and you see an orange light coming from your window. And you walk to your window and you think it's the sun. You think it's morning. And you move the curtain aside and you begin to realize that these are tires burning in the distance. You begin to realize that it's only 3 a.m. We call this scenario Kwara Kwara, a floundering false dawn. You can open your eyes. This is how bad things could be, or could be worse. So what is the Kwara Kwara? The Kwara Kwara is a dance move in which only half of the body is moving, but the other part of the body is displaying so much energy that wants to let that energy out, but there's no way to let it out. So it shows and speaks of a nation that is trying to operate as best as it can, but there are forces that work in the background that prevent that from happening. This scenario speaks of a nation torn between immobility and restless energy, and Kwara Kwara embodies a demoralized land of disorder and decay. This land of order and decay starts around 2019, and you see a lot of people getting away with all of the allegations and all of the crimes that were committed during the state capture era. During this, we start to see a lot of destructive battles between a lot of the political parties and a lot of regions in South Africa. Most importantly, we see weaker state institutions that are unable to perform their duties, and this also results in a lot of public uprisings in the public space. By 2019, we say in this election that the ruling party will probably win by a reduced majority. And by 2024, we say that they will enter into a lot of really fractious coalitions that deliver no value or benefits for the country. We say in this scenario that income inequality is one thing that will continue to increase, and there will be a lack of social cohesion, or very poor social cohesion across the country, across different racial groups, across all different juristic persons within society, and this obviously works to the detriment of the broader public. We say during this scenario, on the journey to 2030, the IMF comes in and starts to play a role within South Africa because we are unable to do what we need to do internally ourselves. Foreign direct investment begins to dry up, and ultimately the economy performs below standard. Basically what we are saying is that if we maintain the current status quo and change nothing, we will end up in this scenario. And this scenario could be as bad as what I've described today, or could possibly be worse than we imagined. So I'm going to take you through the next steps. So we launched, or phase one rather, was the process of us developing the scenarios and engaging with a lot of our stakeholders. And we ended that process on the 21st of June with our official launch at Kyalami. We are now into phase two of the project. And phase two of the project basically speaks about developing focused scenarios. So during this phase, what we will be doing is engaging with different stakeholders, informing them of the work that we've done, wind tunneling our scenarios against their strategies, and more specifically also developing sector-specific scenarios. Phase three of the project, and what we hope will become a reality, is the process of forging a social compact, a social contract between all key stakeholders of society, in which we all understand what we are working towards, and more specifically understand what each party's goal is in achieving that ideal scenario and living in that ideal South Africa that we all imagine. So just to provide more emphasis, what we're currently doing now is just to provide a lot of stakeholder briefings. And as you can see in the next slide, These are the stakeholders that we have engaged. Just to mention some notable stakeholders that we've engaged to date, it's the National Planning Commission, the Presidency. We've consulted with all major political parties in South Africa, and we've engaged with also some stakeholders in the business community in South Africa. Moving on, we're going to be embarking on national roadshows. We're going to be having our first set of roadshows take place in the last week of the 27th of August, and we're going to be starting in PE with the official PE roadshow launch week starting in conjunction with the Mandela Bay Development Agency, and we'll be working together with them to put together this event. We plan to go around the whole country to inform all people in South Africa, as well as capture the views and the opinions of all South Africans on our scenarios and what they think the possible futures could be. Ultimately, what we want to do is engage in a national conversation with all stakeholders involved within their respective areas. And then the last one is that we want to play in the right spaces. We want to engage in the right conversations, particularly in platforms such as this one. We want to see ourselves playing an important role in the upcoming job summit, in the investment summits, and so forth. We also want we want all of these conversations to come together and culminate ultimately into what we envision as the starting process of forging that social compact which we so desperately need in South Africa. I'll now just hand over to Andile, who will just share the last slide on the social compact.
Thank you very much, Vuma, and to Beth as well for sharing with all of you the work that we've been doing. The ultimate objective of this project is to play a key role in forging a social compact between key members of society. I want to start off with the experience of Singapore. Initially, there were tensions between ethnic groups, and tripartism was responsible for dealing with industrial development and productivity and wage increases through a social compact. So we now witnessed a country or a place where on the back of all of the challenges that they had, social compact yielded successful results. We speak of Ireland, Irish Miracle in 2002. This was based on social partnership of political, labor and business. And in 2008, they reviewed and recommitted themselves to another form of partnership under NESC. South Korea, government was able to convince social actors to come on board for South Korea's essentials, such as a strong state, skilled and low-cost labor, maximization surplus for reinvestment. So, here we are, having shared all of this work on the 2030 scenarios. Achieving social cohesion will not happen on its own. It requires the collective effort of men and women who dare to dream. It requires all of us to be bolder in search of a better tomorrow. We need a social compact, a compact that binds us as people across all segments of society. We need to be reaching out more so in 2018, in the year as we remember the luminaries of our time, the likes of Nelson Mandela, Albertina Sisulu, to name but a few. We are hoping that you will reflect on this work of Indlu Lamiti scenarios in your deliberations. We have provided with you with a booklet that we are hoping that you will read and reflect further on. We'd like to take this opportunity to wish you success in your deliberation on this important work that you are doing of building the South Africa that we pray for. Thank you very much for your time.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Lots to think about. And just to confirm, you're saying there's detail of this entire report that's available to everybody, okay? So lots to come there. We're running late, but maybe there's time for 2 questions that I can take very, very quickly. So you just raise your hands very quickly with a short question, we can get an answer. If not, then we'll, okay, there's one and another. If you can get the mic to the gentleman over there. And anybody else? If not, okay, let's do that. We'll get to you later on. There we are. Go there, right. The lady in front there as well. Okay, go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yamkela, and I'm from Outer. 2 quick ones. In the last presentation, you gave the 3 examples of Ireland, Singapore, and Korea. I'm curious to know as to what is the common denominator that you found that was able to bring those scenarios together? In other words, what are the tendons and the ligaments that will enable the different sects of society to work cohesively and achieve those objectives? The second part I want to ask is on the Gwara Gwara scenario that I noted. I have an observation which generates a fear. The observation is that a post-Gupta corruption South Africa will be, and I quote over here, an unsexy, well, there's an argument that says that a post-Gupta corruption South Africa there will be corruption subsequent to that, yet it will be unsexy, but more sophisticated. And you raise the issue over there that there may be instances where those who are responsible will not be held to account. And when that happens in tandem with the fact that now you have this more sophisticated state of corruption, what do you then necessarily think is the appropriate intervention, perhaps from a civil society perspective as well as a state perspective? Thank you.
Okay, got that. Right. Who's going to go for it?
I have the mic.
Okay.
No, but I won't respond long. I'll give over to, particularly to deal with the first question. I just wanted to say a quick thing about the Gwara Gwara, which I also know Vuma will speak to, but I think it relates very strongly to what Ivor was saying in his last presentation. If I take correctly what you mean by unsexy, then I think, as we've all said before, it's already happening. And whether sophistication is the right term, I mean, it is sophisticated, but it's also deep-rooted and embedded and everyday in a way, ordinary almost in many parts of the country, all the way down to the most local level. So what the Gwara Gwara imagines is that our attempts at renewal, at rethinking administration actually fail. And what happens is that we end up with municipalities and really becoming defunct more and more so. And it plays out what the implications of that might be. As to what we do to prevent it, I think it starts now with these kinds of conversations, and we're not the only ones that are having them. And you know, I'm going to stop talking after I promise, but I was at the NEC Lekgotla yesterday, and the questions around the administration, particularly at a provincial level, and the very difficult negotiations between national government and the powers of the provinces was really front and center. How do we pull back municipalities and provinces from the brink of collapse? How do we ensure the stability of public services and so on? So I had some hope following that, a glimpse of hope.
Okay, got that. Do you want to?
I just want to respond to the first question relating to those 3 countries. These are just few examples that we are using. There are many other countries that have been able to forge social compacts. But our research has revealed that there were 4 factors that were present in all of those countries. The first one was that there was a national crisis. Whatever that crisis was, but there was just something that was a crisis and that was prevalent in all of those countries that we have researched. The second one was that ordinary people felt that the current status quo was untenable. And so there was a lot of disenchantment with the status quo, so agitating towards a need for a change. The third one was that the social partners, whether it was government or business or labor, they all felt that they could not go through the crisis on their own, that they needed one another. So they reached out to try and find a way in which they will join forces and work through the crisis on a collective fashion. The last one is that all of these countries, there was always a new administration that came into office with a new vision, new impetus, and a new drive for change. Those four factors, almost in all those countries, were able to take them forward to forge a social compact. Thank you.
Got that. Thank you. Right, the lady go ahead.
Good day. I am Kensani Baloi. I'm a social work graduate, and I'm busy with my master's in social development and social policy at Wits. So I want to acknowledge first that you're dealing with a very comprehensive social issues in South Africa, and your research is social issues integrated. So I want to find out what are the programs that you are offering to new graduates as researchers in order for the youth, the youngsters, to change South Africa. And as you captured on unemployment, is there any graduate recruitment programs that you are working on, perhaps, that the youngsters can be involved in? And if so, how can we get involved with this project to enhance such kind of development here in South Africa? Thank you.
Nothing wrong with an online, on-air job application, but that's fine. I do the same thing, by the way. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm going to be very quick because I know Vuma also wanted to say something in response to the last question. I mean, the short answer is that Ndlula Miti is not an organization in the sense we often imagine organizations, or a kind of collaborative initiative. So we're not offering graduate programs. And there are many organizations who fall under Ndlula Miti, but that's not the form we take. I'll say very quick things, though, is that the young people we interviewed had a lot of really great ideas for how to intervene in questions around unemployment and in linkages. And the one major one that we often talk about is that unemployment is incredibly expensive as an enterprise. It requires that you print CVs, that you have access to data and airtime, that you have transport, and all of these things. One of their kind of big cries in terms of accessing jobs was around vouchers for the unemployed, or forms of support for the unemployed in their job seeking. And in terms of entrepreneurialism, they were also very clear about what they wanted: low interest loans, less difficult bureaucracy, things that will allow them to really begin to get to work on the ideas that they have. So in terms of what the next steps are to how to make those things happen, it's very much in our hands, but it's also been a big conversation with us and our partners and core participants who do have the capacity to run those kinds of graduate initiatives.
Okay, go ahead.
Thanks a lot. I just wanted to jump back to the previous question as well. And it also just goes to the question that the young lady asked. It was around what is the intervention that civil society can play, or interventions that they can take in achieving the South Africa that we want to live in. And I'd just like to ask you a question. How many of you have seen the Naile walk dance move? It's a handful of you. Now, if you try and do that dance move alone, I can guarantee you it will never look good. But if you do it as a collective and in sequence, it looks so much better than when you're doing it alone as an individual. And what that says, it asks a question of what is my individual role, and also in a collective grouping, what is my role that I can play in achieving the South Africa that we want to live in. Civil society, in essence, has one of the biggest roles to play. And if you hear a lot of stories, and I'll make an example of the church, for instance, the church played one of the biggest parts in the liberation of this country. And you hear about a lot of these stories and you read about a lot of these stories of the role that the church played. And the thing is for us as civil society is that when we see things going wrong, it's important for us to speak up about it and keep people in line. And that's what keeps a strong democracy, as opposed to moving into a shell and letting things manifest in the way that they do.
Okay, got that. All right, we're going to leave it at that because we need to break. Thank you for your time, all three of you. Andile, Vuma, Beth, really, really interesting. I look forward to going through the actual detail of that research. I think it's absolutely fascinating. You don't have to answer this. I wondered whether the scenarios are pegged 2030 because of some NDP that's also 2030. But don't answer it. That we're going to have over what we do next. In the Gwara Gwara scenario, there will be no lunch. Thank goodness. We don't have that scenario now, so we have lunch. Thank you. It'll be over there. Just confirm the lunch. It'll be just next door, right? So as you walk out on the left, where you were earlier. And a good evening and a warm welcome, maybe a hot welcome to tonight's convening as a very important debate that we're having. And I say the word hot because I think what we've done in the last few weeks has been particularly hot, particularly strong, I think. Let's reflect what we've done. Week 1, quality education, critically important in South Africa. Week 2, the important issue of anchoring democracy. Week 4, that's next week, healing and reconciliation, all very, very important. So what about the missing week? This week, week 3, it's about economic transformation. And I have to say, if I reflect on myself, for the very first time, we voted on the 27th of April, 1994, and my uncle said, well, what do you feel about voting? And I gave him my thoughts. And then he asked me a question about what I felt about economic changes in the country. And myself said, at this point in time, it doesn't matter. I'm voting for the first time in my life. I don't want to think about that. Of course I'm naive, and I was naive then, because as we know, voting doesn't actually change your life if there's no economic transformation in a country. That's the issue we're facing right now. So welcome indeed to the show. Now, when I say welcome, there's many ways you can interact. You'll be probably watching us on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And you can do this not just watching. I would strongly urge you to ensure that other South Africans and people born outside of South Africa, but visiting the country as well, or maybe working here, are part of this very important debate, this very important dialogue. Because central to all of this is the issue of revisioning South Africa, probably looking at it in a very different way. In marketing speak, you talk about massive changes in how we approach existing problems in a country, because the old ways of doing so just doesn't work. When you are commenting, and we welcome your thoughts, okay, that hashtag convening essay is an important one for you to use. It allows us to amplify the discussion well beyond the show. So we'll talk for just under an hour. And many people have already sent us questions in advance. If you've done just that, well, thumbs up to you, okay? For the rest of you, you can still do that, even comment as the show or this debate proceeds. So what then? Who's going to talk about this important issue insofar as the convening essay economic transformation debate? Well, I've got three people who I think are central to so many things of what we do in our country. The thought of a former Deputy Minister of Finance is always going to be how you're going to be introduced, right? And that's the former Deputy Minister, Mcebisi Jonas. Thank you for your time. Also, one of the 4 presidential investment envoys appointed by President Ramaphosa. I understand that he's been tasked with raising $100 billion to South Africa in the next 5 years. That's a massive, massive responsibility. He's also been the former chair of the Public Investment Company. So good of you to spend the next hour with us, and I think the viewers would absolutely appreciate that as well. The second of the guests we have is Duma Xubule, who's the founder of CEDT, the Center for Economic Development and Transformation, amongst many other things, being a former financial journalist. That book that I haven't quite read, which I need to do it, Making Mistakes, Righting Wrongs, in this case, Insights into Black Economic Empowerment. And then, besides that, his involvement in the past with COSATU, I think in many ways makes you a very important guest for the show. So welcome to the show as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Nomonisa Gasa, whose articles and tweets that I do not miss because they're always important. Even when she says she's tired of whatever people say, she's got strong opinions on a range of issues. A gender activist, a political analyst, somebody I've chatted to very often on my own shows that I've done. A long time ago, ANC Commissioner on Women Emancipation could be relevant to our discussion tonight. And then I found this interesting. She was involved in Nigeria with an organization called IDEA, or IIDEA, which is Democracy and Electoral Assistance in Nigeria. But she has a particular interest around the issue of intersection of land, living custom, construction of identities, and traditional leadership. Some may say that combination puts her, in fact, absolutely at the center of some of the most important issues in our country. So welcome indeed to the show, and thanks for joining us.
Hi, thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you for having me.
Let's then get to all three. I'm going to ask all three of the same question, okay? If the basic discussion is around economic transformation, from your point of view first up, help us answer this question. South Africa would have economically transformed when? And maybe fill in the blanks there.
Look, I mean, it would have been transformed when I think we change, broadly speaking, ownership patterns in our economy. And that also speaks to the need to deal with inequality, which is deep-rooted and growing, actually not going the opposite direction. And secondly, I think if its economic performance improves, just in terms of growth numbers, etc., and also reduce the number of the poor, and youth participation in our economy is broadly increased, and improve the skills formation and human capital in our economy, which is a big problem because of our failing
so
education
those would be amongst
system.
the barometers. Your thoughts on that same question? You know it's transformed when what happens?
You know what? You started off by saying that, talking about the hope that you had when we went to the elections in '94. So if you look at between 1994 and 2017, whichever way you cut and slice the information, it's been a deep disappointment in terms of economic transformation. As the former deputy minister was saying, that if you look at it in terms of GDP per capita, it's been a big disappointment. But what I've been studying lately is that we are now in the worst post-apartheid economic crisis. So what has happened is that since the global financial crisis, our economy has just ground to a halt. So what does this mean in practice? It means between 2009 and 2017, our economy grew by 1.6% a year. And if you measure that in per capita terms, we grew by 0.3% per year. And that is the economic equivalent of standing still. Now, many people like to, and what has happened over that period is that unemployment has grown by about 3.65 million people to 9.5 million people. So what you have today in South Africa is that using the expanded, more realistic unemployment rate, we have 41% black Africans unemployed. In the Eastern Cape, where half of my family comes from, it's at a frightening 46%. So where we are now, and is that we will reach what a Tunisia moment in South Africa, where a police shoots a hawker and the whole thing just erupts. I think we're approaching that moment very soon.
Okay, so therefore, that point, economic transformation for you will happen when what happens?
Yeah, in successful countries, they double. I've studied a lot about East Asia. And they tend to have, most of the successful countries in East Asia, they have a mobilizing vision and plan. And each of the mobilizing visions and plan, they say we'll double the size of the economy every 10 years. And we will grow by 7% a year. And that is how they double in size. Now, if you look at like that happened in Japan, they had an income doubling plan. It happened in Malaysia. They said, in fact, in Malaysia between 1990 and 2010, they're going to increase the economy 8 times between, I think, 1970 and 2000. And they did do that, So I think we need to, as South Africa, get our economic performance moving. There's no other way. Now, a lot of people blame the global financial crisis, and that is completely not true.
What the causes may be. Namalisa, give us the first crack on that one. South Africa is economically transformed when what happens?
Well, firstly, when we have a clear policy on policy and vision on what the land means in this country, what our policy as a society is on land, when we understand that land is of no value in and of itself until you attach that value. And then when we translate the value that we attach onto land and ensure that we use that to address a number of issues that, that land stands for. You know, the history of this country, you know, ownership of property, of land, access to land, both urban and rural, understanding where the resources of this country come from. For example, we would have economically transformed when we understand that some of the critical resources of this country do not come from urban South Africa, actually come from a land that is what is called in post-apartheid speak traditional communities, which in the past were the Bantustans. Iron ore is in KZN. Platinum belt is in what we would consider rural northwest. So when we are able to figure out how to balance where we get the resources from land and how the people from whom the resources actually are taken, from whose land the resources are taken, who suffer the most, who have silicosis, who have all these kinds of conditions, are able to say we have something to show in the same way that your urban so-called unregistered, undocumented people that is in shanty towns and all that, you would have had economic transformation when we are able to revise how we use the urban space, how we revisit the apartheid planning and spatial design, when we begin to envision that African people don't have to live in RDP houses and that we have resources perhaps to think through this and put this in place. So for me, South Africa would have economically transformed on the way towards economic transformation when we look at different kinds of models that we can use on the land question and look at land as a critical resource.
As a vehicle.
As a critical resource, both in terms of what is on the surface, but also in terms of what is below the surface. And in terms of what is on the surface, of course, the forestry, then all the natural resources, all the what we call primary resources, fisheries, and all these things. When we are able to say, what is enough for you? What is enough for this person? I think we would have been moving towards economic transformation.
Okay, it's an interesting thought to bring up. You know, from my point of view, and I'll give you my my simple formula that I've used often to say, away from rural, because I'm very much a city boy, right? That when townships look like suburbs and you can't make out the difference, then you would have known the country has dramatically changed, which, as you know, is not the case at all. So why then is the issue of economic transformation particularly important? But perhaps you can help us with that, former deputy minister. Critically, why is it that important?
Does the gentleman have a name, actually?
Well, yes, I suppose so. Go ahead.
Okay.
We've introduced him beforehand.
Oh,
Look,
okay.
I mean, it is fundamentally important that we transform our economy. I mean, think about it. By and large, I think we are still a commodity-based economy.
Yeah.
To begin with, highly reliant on commodity trade and commodity prices, as it were. So I mean, and of course, notwithstanding the fact that we're messing up with policy around mining, for instance, over the last couple of years, I think we could have, if we had better strategy for investment and growth in the sector, we probably would have generated better results and be more competitive in the sector. Putting that aside, I think we remain in that space. I mean, that's why I think the 2008 crisis impacted so negatively upon South Africa. And even at a point when South Africa was growing, we didn't invest much in the productive sector. I mean, as it were. I think we grew a consumptive budget, understandably so. We have to grow education. We have to ensure that we invest in health, etc., public health, etc., improvements. But I think many countries who survived the crisis did so primarily because there was a lot of investment in a period where there was growth in the productive sector. Manufacturing was a focus, and it was growing, etc.,
But
etc.
let
And
me-
in South Africa, we have not done that very well,
Okay.
except for the auto sector, where government has actually had a sizable.
But you
and-
see, in many other countries in the world, if we ask the question about economic transformation of a country, let's say whether it's, and the example of Asia came up earlier, so whether it's India to going further down to Singapore or Korea, etc., that economic transformation would talk about just how the country goes about and does its business and how it impacts on its citizens. In the South African context,
obviously,
does economic transformation mean color?
It does.
Colour change.
In part it does. I mean, because what you're saying is that you've got to deal with historical realities. I mean, and historical reality is that you have embedded inequality, which is racial in character, but also you have, I mean, a legacy of Bantu education in part, and a host of those things, and the spatial realities
Okay,
of
let me pick
apartheid
up on that.
spatial.
I mean, would you agree with that economic transformation in South Africa is not just about changing economic systems, for example, but it must impact on the racial demographic that we have?
Yes, but I just want to step back before I answer that. So these countries that I've looked at, so they had a mobilizing vision. They had the state capacity to transform the economy. It always starts with the state capacity. Then they had a massive upgrading of human capital. And it's like quite mind-boggling, the things that they achieved on the human capital side, access to education on a mass scale. And they did industrial upgrading. So what it means is that they create jobs for the profile of the people they currently have. And most of those countries, the people were as uneducated as South Africa, and as the people got more educated, they created jobs up the value chain. And then the last thing is that they had the use of macroeconomic policy tools. They used multiple tools, they had multiple objectives, and so I believe that the system which we're using to govern our macroeconomic policy is a bit, what can I say, it's a bit outdated compared to what those countries did. Now, on the land, to get to your question, I think economists are not sure where to put the land in this thing. Some people would say it's a factor of production and so forth, yeah. But anyway, so now ownership is critical. I've spent a lot of time discussing, you might be surprised about ownership. So there's a lot of fake statistics around black ownership on the stock exchange, and the ones that I do are the correct ones.
Okay, there you are.
So let me start. So one of the topics that we had here was to discuss financialization. So we have excessive financialization in our economy. You've got a stock exchange that is 3 times our GDP.
Okay, help us explain the word financialization.
Okay, so
What does that
financialization is a process whereby finance feeds on itself and it grows faster than the economy without expanding the productive base. So there are very many indicators to measure it, and he's written about it, but I just wanted to focus on one. So when we look at the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, black ownership is about 2.8% of the shares on the JSE, and the way I measure it, I look at actual shares and subsidiaries at the subsidiary levels, but the majority of the JSE has got nothing to do with the South African economy. So about 2/3 of the JSE, this is part of the financialization program, we allowed these massive inward listings of companies like AB InBev, which just distorted everything in the JSE. And you have this Naspers animal, which accounts for 20% of the JSE, and it's in China. So we allowed this thing. I don't understand why we actually allowed it, because it increases our vulnerability to external shocks in the economy, because all these dividends are flowing out and so forth. But anyway, so if you strip out the non-South African assets, black ownership is about 7%, 8%, 7.5%, and it's by coincidence, that's the same amount that we have achieved for land, from what I've read, about 7 to 8%.
And just to confirm, non-South African assets, therefore,
you strip out all
how much? Not so much in black, in terms of what percentage of non-South African assets are held in South Africa?
No. Okay, so on the JSE, 2/3 of the JSE it's got nothing to do with the South African economy.
Okay, that gives us the answer.
Yeah.
Let's get your thoughts. You spoke about land up front as an issue around economic transformation. What do you propose needs to happen there?
Well, I mean, firstly, you say that the land is it corresponds with the JSE figures in terms of black ownership, which is around 7.8%. In reality, those figures in terms of land are actually also huge distortion. right? Because what has been transferred and under the so-called redistributive program of the land and development, land and rural development, actually has been dismal failure. So you would put the success at 3%, if that much, and if you break it down, that 3% also would, the companies or the beneficiaries that have succeeded are the ones who've gone the big commercial route and partners with companies like Triple Z, 7 and so on and so forth. So you need to unpack that. But most importantly, former Deputy Minister of Finance has raised an important issue around the fact that our manufacturing sector in this country is very low. But it is the story of this continent. It is the story of this continent which reproduces raw materials and sends them elsewhere and then receives them
And pays a
and
higher
then
price for
sell them. And for me, that is critical to land, actually. So when people say land is, there are so many ways in which people talk about land and the economy. It's as if it's on the side. It's like on the side. Actually, it isn't. The gold that you take and you send elsewhere and then it comes back and it has value because now it has more value because it has been processed. It actually comes from land. Platinum, that's the same thing, right?
So therefore,
forestry in the context of climate change, right? Forestry, you've got to look differently on how land intersects on everything. Actually,
So therefore,
so hold on.
right.
So you look at habitat, housing, you look at production, you look at all these things, and you have to see that all these things are connected. If you decide you're going to build houses in this place or build a new city in this place, you've got to answer. That's what many countries are moving towards. What's the impact on primary resources, forestry, water, all these things? And we as South Africans, we are not anywhere closer to that. And here I'm not even talking about peri-urban settlements. I'm talking about the bishops' courts, even, because there is no regard for the fact that land and whatever is derived from land is not, an infinite resource.
So here's the thought. The issue of land right now is not just an economic debate, it's a political debate, right? So let's say
more than that.
Right, and far more. Without spending too much time on that, let's just say it finally gets resolved, okay, in some way or the other.
It won't.
When it did you say it?
No, it won't.
It won't get resolved.
Unless you have a completely different thought process and you don't look at land and saying, oh, we'll deal with a few who have been dislocated, maybe a little bit of restitution here and there. Unless you actually, all South Africans, including the Russians are paying tax now by billions, unless they all look at what is the centrality of land in this
Okay, so let's just say, and I will pick up on the problems, but let's just say it is resolved, okay? How then would it be expected to change South Africa? So tomorrow morning we wake up, the land issue is resolved.
Firstly, we'd have different cities. Firstly, your cities would look differently. Secondly, your architecture would look differently because you would think you don't have endless forests, so you can't just use natural resources willy-nilly. Thirdly, you would look at fishery rights. You would look at water usage, how you build your houses, how you build your city, how you plan your city, the color, the texture, color in terms of race, the texture, and everything that goes with that would be very different. A number of countries are actually doing this. Australia is in fact now saying they can no longer talk about land as an independent, but they have to talk about land in relation to other ministries that they have, including the vexed question of the Aboriginal.
Okay. Let me pick up on that. So the Minister made the point that that issue won't be resolved unless. Okay. What are your thoughts?
Look, I mean, tapping on the issue, I think where we are, my view, of course, is that we're at a point, because of all these factors that we're talking about, if you like, the national kind of social contract that we had in '94 is crumbling. actually, effectively. That's what
So
you have.
let's get right. The social contract of 94
It's
is
crumbling. Because, I mean, remember that it was based on a consensus about the kind of economy we're building, the political architecture of the country, and everybody theoretically has a stake in that. So what are you finding happening now because of all of these things, poor economic performance and the failure to deal with some of the land issues? And in fact, the debate of on land, for instance, needed to start by assessing why have we not implemented the
Absolutely.
policy that we adopted in 94.
Absolutely.
And once you start looking at that, for me, it comes back to the issue of state capacity and the capability of the state. So you had policy, and you can't pretend as if from 94 up to now there was no policy. There was policy.
And therefore, did state, and you were part of it, did it
And you
have capability and capacity?
You have to deal with the issue of state capability to move forward as a critical component in the puzzle, in the big puzzle. But the point I wanted to make is that there is a need for a new conversation in this country about, firstly, how do we deal with the dismal economic performance that we've had up to now? How do we kind of address issues of inequality? How do we address, issues of growth? Because, there are sacrifices that we have to make in order to achieve growth in all across the board. We have to ensure that there's domestic capital invest more in our economy. What do we need to do to get them to put more in that? We have ensured that productivity increases and a whole range of other things that we need to do. So there is a need for a new conversation that begins to shape a new economic vision.
A new conversation, ironically, we call ourselves convening SA, and it is in many ways a conversation that we are having with you being the entire country. You reflect and represent the entire nation. So hashtag convening SA, let other people join
because
and look at some of the points there, yeah?
Of course, if you don't do that, the danger, because I think the problems are so big.
Yeah.
The danger that we're facing, we're looking in their faces, that people are likely to take short-term solutions.
Oh, yeah.
To problems that require a long-term view.
Okay.
And it might actually come back to bite us. And we also have the rise of populism given...
All right. Are people taking, when I say people, government, business, activists, are they taking and looking for short-term solutions to this
what
problem?
amazes me is that you have the three main... I was at NEDLAC last week presenting on the things that you're talking about. So you have the ANC, the three major parties, the DA, you have the EFF, then you have the social partners, business, labor. None of them have put on the table a plan to get us out of this crisis. So at NEDLAC last week, Monday and Tuesday, they were asking many of us to come up and put forward plans as to how to get us out of this crisis. So I agree with Mcebisi that what we need is almost like a reset button. Start again, a new conversation, whatever you want to call it.
Can I throw in this word, economic Codesa, which was discussed before?
Yes, I think we do. We need an economic Codesa. But the problem, the president has announced that he wants a summit on the economy, but we have seen where the previous summits happened. Let me start. We had 1998, the Job Summit. Then we had the Growth and Development Summit in 2003. We've had so many of these things, but the problem was that the government tried to dictate what could be discussed and what could not be discussed. So I'm saying if you start dictating and prescribing what is off the table, they said macroeconomic policy is off the table, it can't be discussed, so it's a waste of time. So I think we should discuss everything. The land issue, we should discuss everything.
Put differently, I think there should be no holy cows.
Thank you. That's what I mean.
Which means playing outside the rules of parliament. I'm sure you have much to say about economic Codesa and whatever.
Oh, absolutely. Firstly, I have a very serious problem in calling it economic Codesa because that in itself is very limiting. I think one of the things that we have in this country that has happened, and none of us thought it would ever happen to us, is that we are suffering from a crisis of imagination. The majority of people who put forward policies suffer from a crisis of imagination. And until we get over that and say, as Mcebisi says, that we need to revisit the social compact in 1994 and agree that it may have been okay for them, and there are certain lessons that we have learned, and assess and look at what it is, what kind of social compact we would be looking at now. I think, firstly, that would have to be a very honest assessment of where we have succeeded and where we have failed, and the mistakes that we have made. And secondly, it would have to look at how do we view a number of institutions. You know, private sector is one. Traditional, the institution of traditional leadership is another, especially in relation to land and in relation to democracy. And all these things, and one of the things that I think we're beginning to learn is that all these things are actually intersecting and very, you know, interlinked. So it requires some level of confidence in ourselves to say that, listen, it might be very difficult, but we think it can be done.
Okay, so 2 points out of that. Economic CODESA is very limiting, so I'm going to rely on you to maybe coin a new phrase. What, and hopefully it'll gain currency, which is an interesting word to use. What would be that phrase, if not economic CODESA?
I'm not into phrases.
Then
Actually,
what are we
generally,
saying?
I'm on Twitter, but I'm not into hashtags.
A convention.
I think a conversation. I think a conversation, a series of conversations, reimagining South Africa from where we are, you know, from a very honest assessment of where we are. And I don't think that's going to happen with one conversation, by the way.
Absolutely.
You know,
many conversations,
I think there are going to have to be many conversations. One of the things that we didn't do in the 90s that I think we have to learn now is that we didn't build into the system. How are we going to get together as a people periodically and say, are we still with it? You know, and if we need to veer, you know, in a different direction, and then have a conversation
how do we meet
with
up?
that,
Yeah.
and you know, and talk to each other.
So let me put it this way. I mean, whatever we're saying is all very, very important, and a person watching may say, but that's what Parliament is for. They
No,
meet
actually,
regularly.
that's part of
Where's
the
the
problem.
difference? Yeah.
That's part of the problem. The problem is that Parliament are elected representatives. Government has its own responsibility. I think that one of the lessons that we learned in the early 90s or towards the end of, beginning of 90s was actually a civil society. Civil society is a very problematic
term,
concept. Yeah, but was a situation where a citizenry, right, disengaged, because we now have all the people from exile. We had our leaders out of prison. We had our elected representatives. And I think it's important to say that, yes, Parliament has a role. Yes, government has a role, but that citizens, in fact, are the pulse of society.
Will Parliament, and maybe the examples as in Fees Must Fall, but overall, is it not accurate to say that Parliament really won't allow that? Because
I'm sorry.
if they
You're
don't,
not going to convince
there's a
me of
power
that.
on the outside.
You are never going to convince me of that. I am a product of the 1980s.
Okay.
Right? I'm a product of that time when there was state of emergency. I know what citizens can do. I know what ordinary people can do.
But
And
does our
it
current
need
Parliament
not-
have the appetite? What I'm saying is they may
Well,
be
that
forced to
parliament
do it.
that parliament didn't have appetite either. But what we can do now, because it need not necessarily be hostile, but you do need to have. I'll give you an example, right? Last year, when people were saying, well, this is South African speak, so I'll speak as I do. When people were hurtful.
I knew you were going to say that.
Yes,
yeah.
when people
But
were
okay.
hurtful with Zuma, right? And not just Zuma, and everything and everybody else that went with it. People were out in the street, right? But as soon as that which was in your face was removed, people then
Retreated.
disengaged,
Yeah.
right? And forgot that it wasn't about an individual. It was about a system that had reproduced and reproduced itself. A system, by the way, that we inherited from apartheid in so many different ways. And so the danger now is that you may think you dealt with that, and you might have a rude awakening that you actually haven't, or a new phenomenon is being born, right? And so I think it's important for people actually, for example, convening South Africa is one of the important platforms, but there should be many others. But it shouldn't just be talk shops, you know, it should be what people were doing.
But okay, interesting point. If it's not a talk shop, you see, my concern about it is who in Parliament is going to allow a discussion outside of Parliament to have the muscle that will impact on change at Parliament?
Look, I mean,
Willingly, that is.
think about it. I mean, policy at the moment, it's normally driven from the perspective of the ruling party. I mean, cut the frills. I mean, in this debate. So I think
it's not
the
even
argument,
parliament, it's one party.
Ultimately, that's the case. Is your problem is increasingly that politics should change in some way.
Yeah.
I mean, in a sense. I mean, because I think what you are arguing is that in '94 you had a national consensus
Yeah.
to say we're cutting
with
apartheid and we're moving in a particular direction, and these are the frameworks. We adopted constitution and a number of other things and so on and so on, and we created a particular hope about economic transformation, about all of these things that we're talking about now. Now, the extent of the crisis, I mean, you ran the numbers about the numbers of the unemployed and et cetera, we are near a crisis if we're not at a kind of a crossroads in a sense. Because if we do not grow the economy moving forward, if we don't increase investment in our economy, relatively, and if we don't improve education outcomes in our economy, but I think and create at least some national obsessions around education, around growth, around all of these things. I tell you now that we probably will have a different country in a couple of years.
So how then do we reach national consensus? I mean,
I
to the
think
point where you've got the ruling party or the governing party?
Yeah, we need to have many parallel conversations. Last weekend, I was at the mining summit. We were trying to forge a new vision for... Now, in 1994, there were many civil society formations. If we're discussing education, there's a National Education Crisis Committee. If you're discussing local government, there were NGOs like Plan Act. If you're discussing, that were engaging these things. And there were so many of them. So let's just think. We have to talk about mining. We have to talk about land. I was with the doctors recently. We were talking about national health. And when you mention the numbers that we have to do to make this thing, this dream of national health insurance a possibility, you're talking about huge numbers. You're talking about complex issues. When you talk about the education system, to reset the education system, start from scratch. I liked the analogy that you used when you says the township, you won't see the difference between the township and the suburb. So one of the things that we did, and we listened to the wrong people, was that we didn't equalize the two education systems. We didn't equalize the two health systems. We listened to this propaganda that we were spending 6% of GDP on education and we shouldn't spend more. But if you look at Malaysia in the book that I did, I told you in the foreword, the president of Malaysia, he says, during our catch-up phase, we spent 11% of GDP, and once we had stabilized, we went back to the 6%. So that's what you do in the catch-up. You initially incur higher expenditures in rebuilding these institutions, and then you normalize to what normal countries do.
But I do need to say this. I do need to say this. When you say Parliament is not going to allow this, I think it's very important that we take lessons from what has been happening in the last 10 years.
In our country?
Yeah.
Okay.
If rural women in particular and other alliances of rural people had not said the traditional courts bill is not going to go in the way that it does because it cuts on our rights, it does this, that and the other. If they didn't do that and risked, as we speak, there are people in KZN who don't sleep in their homes, right? They stopped it. The ruling party in 2013 had to allow it to lapse because there was no consensus in the provinces, in the ruling party itself, right? Eastern Cape had a particular mandate, Mpumalanga, etc., especially the ones that were mainly rural, right? So it's also important to understand that Parliament is not this institution that sits there that is not impacted upon by what people say. When people went, I'm talking about people who had never been outside of their villages, let alone, just going to Durban, have never been on aeroplanes. When they went and talked to parliamentarians about their lived reality, in KZN, in Mpumalanga, in all these places, parliamentarians were ashamed. When Parliament went out and was forced to go and listen to people where they live, because that's what Rule 73 of Parliament says. So there's a way in which even a small organized community or community of like-minded people who may not necessarily agree on everything, and around a specific issue, as Duma says, right? There's a way in which that can have a ripple effect. You can look at that. For me, the Traditional Courts Bill is one of the very important case studies of post-apartheid South Africa that has not yet been studied closely.
Okay, maybe that issue of what's happening in KwaZulu-Natal is another good example of that.
Or
The
Eastern
issue of-
Cape, for that matter.
Well,
Or
absolutely. The
Mpumalanga.
issue of economic transformation is a critically important one, and that's what we're discussing here today. Hashtag convening SA. Now, we've asked people to contribute, and you can give us your opinions right away. We'll pick up some of them right now. Others will be answered even after the show. We'd also ask people to broaden the conversation, and you do that by just sharing what we're talking about right now, whether you're on Twitter, on YouTube, watching us on YouTube, or certainly on Facebook, as in Facebook Live. I've picked out some of the comments. Some people have commented even before the show. So I'm going to just pick out some of them that I think are really interesting. Incelia is saying, well, the current structure of the IPPs, okay, introduces an unnecessary middleman. Furthermore, locks us into old technologies for periods up to 25 years in rapidly improving industries. It's unsustainable for Eskom to facilitate the loss of its customers. I'm just going to read out a couple of them because it gives us a sense of where we are, even if we can't answer all of them in one way. Ashraf Dokrat saying, one of the greatest scourges of our economic life is the devastating effect of interest and usury on our daily lives. Think banking in this case here. It affects the poorest as well. How do we curb the stranglehold the banks have on our people? Perhaps I'll throw in another one for us to consider, the issue of economic systems. We tend to adopt a capitalist system. Others talk about a socialist system. How many other systems are there absolutely working? Why don't we know about that one? Tumelo's saying, with somewhat free education in South Africa, what's wrong with it if it keeps producing unemployable graduates? That issue of unemployable is another important one. Maybe the last one for now. Neil Coleman saying, in every country, just about, the disproportionate economic clout of those at the top has provided these individuals with wildly disproportionate influence on their country's political life and on its media, on what policies are pursued and whose interests end up being ignored. Let me just see if I pick out one more. And thanks for the many. People have done it over a range of different platforms here. Zanele Luana talking about Stratcom. Is Stratcom Media allowed to tell us about tough times? I think not. It's a whole lot more, but I'm not going to read all of that. Okay, there's just a range of some of the thoughts that's come through there. Let's then talk about. So I just want to stay with the issue of power of the people. Do we, and we meaning the four of us, people watching us, and the entire country, looking at the two recent, I mean, you gave the example of the traditional bill that you spoke about, right? There's a discussion going on in KwaZulu-Natal now around land, and we know that. But if you go back in the last few years, the issue of fees must fall and then decolonize education. All this started effectively from people, in this case, students, right? And they were able to set the agenda. Do you think, by and large, that as part of this national debate around economic transformation and a whole range of other issues, that people generally underestimate just how much power they have? So what I think, students come in, give us ideas, make changes, then step out, and we've seen that with others as well. But overall, do we fully understand just how much power people have outside of Parliament?
Of course. I think we also patronize people. I think it's a very interesting thing. So, on the one hand, we either sort of like have this very patronizing attitude towards this thing called the people. And here I'm talking about the poor, in whose name all these things are done. And then on the other hand, have this sanctimonious thing that everything they do is right, and forget that they too are part of the system. So if you talk about, let me just backtrack a bit. If you talk about state capture, for example, right? It's not just about rands and cents, right?
What is it about?
It is also about how it has altered the culture of this country. It's about how it has social consequences, the social cost, the social damage at every level, right? You go to any community, it doesn't matter the political party, by the way, whether it's DA or whatever. I mean, I've been to communities where people are no longer bearing each other, right? That's the extent of that's the extent of the level of social damage that you get. So we also need to look at that. Secondly, there will always be people who ignite, a certain action and a certain thought process. So whether it is students, whether it is rural people, whether it is workers, whether it is, anybody, what is important is that we also need not romanticize them, because another form of patronizing is when you romanticize people. So when students come and say fizz must fall, we then need to sit around the table properly and say, what are the consequences of this? How do we go about this? Because if you don't discuss it properly, you are in fact going to have kind of cynical policies where you say, okay, we'll do that just to make it go away.
And
then it doesn't,
really
and it doesn't
good
go
for
away.
the country anyway, yeah.
So you've got to have to think about, when you talk about decolonization, right? My preoccupation at UCT is about how you don't look at customary law as separate from other law, right? How you look at customary marriages in line with, together with Muslim marriages, together with Judaic marriages, together with civil marriages and so on. That's what decolonization ought to be, because there is no little corner of South Africa that exists in and of itself.
Yeah, it's a good point. Let me then pick up on and I'll get both your thoughts on this one, that, there are many, we could have this discussion just on the technical aspects of an economy, but I think that will take far too long. We'll probably need 2-3 hours. But central to South Africa's problems is it fair to say that human rights and social justice is not central to our economic policies, and it should be if it's not? Your thoughts on that?
Yes, but Ashraf, I'm really concerned about, we've got a present crisis. And then what I was saying earlier on is that South Africa, in the same period, 2009 to 2017, we've underperformed every region in the world. Yeah, let me give you an example. The world economy over the same period has grown by 5%. The world economy has grown by 3.8%. Emerging markets have grown by 5%. Emerging and developing Asia has grown by 7%. So you go down, 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 and then you get to South Africa, which has grown by 1%. So South Africans must not believe that what is happening is because of the global situation.
Yeah.
The global situation recovered long ago.
So our competitors are actually doing very well.
Our competitors are doing very well. So we should ask ourselves, why is it only South Africa? So I would say there were the wrong policies that we followed after 2009. And I'll give you two examples. So the first thing that we did that was wrong, our central bank started, the global financial crisis started in 2007, and it went on until 2008, 2009. So our central bank started increasing interest rates before the global financial crisis, 250 basis points. And then after June 2007, they continued increasing interest rates. Now, in the other countries, what did they do? They implemented expansionary monetary and fiscal policies to counter the loss of demand from exports from the rich countries, which collapsed during 2009. So we didn't do that. Our central bank was increasing interest rates against every single central bank in the world was cutting interest rates. So what I'm trying to say, and then the fiscal stimulus that happened in these countries was huge. The United Nations estimated that this fiscal stimulus of 48 the largest emerging markets, for which data is available, was about 5% of GDP in those countries. That is a huge number. If you look at China, just after the global financial Lehman, 2008 September, 2 months later they announced a $600 billion stimulus. And the following year they announced a doubling of the state loans from the state-owned companies to about 1.4 trillion rands. So the Financial Times estimated that the Chinese stimulus was about 15% of GDP. Now, what she was saying is that we lack imagination in what we can do to get us out of this crisis. So we have to employ extraordinary tools that have not been. So the lesson, when you look at the Great Recession of the 30s and the Great Recession of the 10 years ago, is that you have to implement like really bold policies to counter what is happening in the global situation.
Let's talk about imagination.
I just wanted to stress though, I agree probably broadly. But I think for me the central issue is you cannot erode the capacity of the state and hope to achieve better results in terms of the performance of the economy.
So your understanding of eroding the capacity of states would be what? State capture, corruption?
Let's face it, from 2008 onwards, we have seen key institutions of the state being destroyed, effectively. For a host of other regions, for a host of reasons. Some of the reasons relate to state capture, but others relate just to pure bad deployment, and others are bad policies sometimes, and et cetera. And for me, I believe strongly that without strong institutions in your economy, you are likely to have bad results. Now, that's the one point that I think that's important. So thinking about changing path and changing direction should also be about remodeling our institutions, rebuilding our institutions, enhancing capacity.
Statecraft itself.
Besides the imagination,
Look, I mean,
because it's been eroded.
part of it is that we need to move away from this thing, and I seriously believe that this thing of looking at institutions in electoral cycles is problematic.
Oh, yeah.
So, what you have over the last couple of years, is that the new minister changes DG, and he probably gets changed in a year down the line. The new one changes the DGs and so on and so on and so on. And you have the same thing with CEOs of SOEs, boards of SOEs, and et cetera, et cetera.
Isn't that a weakness of democracy?
No. Let me give you an example. I was at the Department of Transport.
Right.
I'll mention it. Long ago, and the new minister arrived after the previous minister died, and the people that I was reporting to, nothing happened for a year. Yeah,
that's what happens.
Nothing. Everything had frozen.
So
he tried to have a
transport,
meeting.
nothing was moving. Ironically,
Yeah, for a year. Yeah, nothing.
So the point, I think the lesson, one of the lessons, if you look at advanced countries, etc., one of the lessons is creating
Continuity,
sustainable institutions with continuity that cuts across political regimes.
Oh, absolutely.
If you fail to do that, the likelihood of impacting on development, on the economy,
isn't the weakness of that political parties won't buy into that? We speak about the ruling or the governing party.
In many countries.
It's happening in many countries. It's
but isn't
happening.
that the weakness?
But there's
I think for me, I think we've always assumed that there's correlation. Let's take it. Good education is important for everyone.
Outside of election cycles.
Outside of elections.
It's not for ANC members.
It's not for ANC members, it's not for DA members. It is good for everyone.
Yeah.
Growth is fundamentally important for everyone. So and that's why I'm saying the national conversation, apart from doing other things, is just to set basic rules about what we consider important in this country. What is our obsession?
One of the conversations
you can
that
have,
we
you can
never
have a
had.
country that says growth is an incident, it's coincidental.
Well, what's the difference therefore between economic transformation, which is what we're talking about, and radical economic transformation?
Sure.
It's like, does radical mean like catch up? When a learner doesn't go to school for 10 months and they need to pass an exam in the 11th month.
Well, for me,
Look, for me, again, I'm not hung up on concepts. All what I'm saying is that we have to change path as a country. That's all that I'm saying. Part of it is about ensuring that we have certain basic things that we all prioritize and agree on. Like the one is around growth. If we don't grow the economy, we've actually stuffed. And if we can't do that as quickly as possible, we're gone. If we can't ensure that we increase investment in our economy, both domestic and foreign investment, because I think, again, domestic investment is so fundamentally important, but also investment in particular sector. The labor intensivity of our economy is very low. And we've got to improve and drive improvements in that space, as it were. Again, the issue of ensuring that you broaden participation in our economy, inclusivity, is fundamentally important. Now, for me, if you can do that, we have not been able to do that. That's radical enough for me.
Okay, and just very quickly, we're going to wrap up shortly. That initial point about yourself being one of those 4 wise people, male, female, to raise $100 billion in 5 years. How far down the track are you on doing that?
Look, there are 2 advantages we have, though I don't know, Mr. Kubul, what your point, what your comment is. The 2 advantages we have at the moment, I think, in part, the global economic environment is improving. whether we like with some problems there and there. But generally, it's generally going in the right direction, which is good, I mean, for us. But secondly, linked to that, of course, is new technologies, artificial intelligence, and all those things that are happening, which has huge potential to create a new wave of industrialization in South Africa that we can have. The second one is that, let's face it, I mean, we have a moment after the last 10 years where at a space where there is optimism in the country. And and for me, it provides
yet the weekend
us.
paper says playtime is over, right?
It provides us with a basis for a real serious debate across all sectors of society.
But the debate is not happening at the moment.
It's not happening.
Yeah.
And we're not
Why is it not
exploiting that.
Let's to take on what Mcebisi was saying. The first quarter GDP went down 2.whatever%,
yeah.
and it was the worst performance in 9 years, despite this alleged increase in confidence. And the latest stats that are coming out suggest that we'll have another quarter of declining GDP growth. So it could be a recession. Now, if that doesn't cause South Africans to take it seriously, and I would argue, you know, there's ideology in economics, so you can't run away from it.
Yeah,
so there's in the Keynesian tradition, they say investment won't happen unless there's growth. So investment does not depend on policy certainty and those type of things and business confidence. It depends on what Marxians would call the profitability of investment. So I don't see investment happening in a country that is not growing. Now, let me just tell you, there is a period in South Africa, a short period, where we did see economic growth.
Which was when?
Between 2004 and 2008. So we created 2 million jobs during that period. Unemployment came down, and it was a period of progress. Now, the reason why, we must ask ourselves, why did that happen? What happened then is that there was the end of the gear policy, there was the expansionary monetary policies, and there was expansionary fiscal policy. I saw one statistic from National Treasury which said that during that period, government expenditure had increased by 10% per year in real terms. Fixed investment was increasing. It went up to 24% from 18%. State-owned enterprises were investing again. So what I'm saying, as South Africans, we need to enter into a new phase of expanding our productive capacity as a country, and we now need to use emergency measures to get our economy growing again.
And maybe that point about radical thinking, isn't it?
Well, you know what, the thing is, whether it's, for me, my answer always to this thing about radical economic transformation, I always say that, well, the results will show, whether it is radical or not. And I think the point that Mcebisi is making and that that what we need to really talk about is when you don't have stability in the system, and this has got nothing to do with, investing agencies and all these things. It's just about the stability in the country, right? So we've never in this country really had a conversation about statecraft, about the fact that there are certain functions that obviously are political appointments.
Tomorrow, in those very, very focused discussions, and I'll be fascinated to see what finally emerges from that, okay? But let's move on then. For the next presentation around scene setting, I'd like to call upon Advocate Yasmin Sooka, who's the CEO of the Foundation for Human Rights. And I think most of you will understand that just about everything that Yasmin Sooka does is very much around human rights. It's very much something she's embraced. So please put your hands together for Yasmin Sooka. Thank you. And what would happen is Yasmin will present for, I think, a maximum of 20 minutes, and we'll probably take 3 questions at the back of that until we make up some time, okay? So we won't have just 5 or 10, 20 minutes, and then 3 questions. Yasmin, the stage or the platform is all yours. Thank you. And looking forward to it. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for inviting me to what's really an important event. Perhaps just some background on the survey. The Foundation for Human Rights is an NGO that was created in 1996 by former President Mandela and the European Union. And in the period since then, the European Union was the primary funder to the program, which supports non-governmental organizations in South Africa to deal with the legacy of apartheid and, of course, to promote constitutionalism. But every 5 years, the Foundation carries out a survey which really looks at three questions. Question of access to the Constitution and rights. The second is an awareness of the rights in the Constitution. And the third, of course, is the question of attitude. I think all of you will agree that in the last 10 years, what we have seen is an erosion, really, in terms of respect for the Constitution in certain quarters. But an important question, of course, is why do we need to carry out these surveys? And that's because you can't really address the question of improving awareness and also dealing with where the gaps are if you don't actually have empirical evidence. And so this is probably the largest survey in the country. It was done with the help of Stats South Africa, and it interviewed more than people in 24,000 households across the country. And the way in which the sampling was done, it was done in a very stratified way so that the findings actually can be extrapolated to the population of South Africa. Importantly, of course, I think the biggest lesson in the last 10 years is that we conducted 24,897 interviews, and in fact we covered more than 4,165 sites. The last time we carried out a survey like this was in 2011, and in that survey we only interviewed 4,200 respondents across 22 sites. The reason, of course, we do this is that everybody talks about South Africa having a progressive constitution, but of course, if you don't know that you enjoy rights in the Constitution and that in fact the Constitution can become a tool that you use to access your rights and improve the quality of your life, then it doesn't really make a difference. And that's really what we were trying to look at. Shockingly, of course, if you look at the figures, between 2011 and 2017, the levels of awareness in the country only increased from 47% to 51%. And in the case of women, less than half of the women in South Africa had actually heard about the Constitution. And when it came to the question of human rights, only 40% of the population were satisfied with the state of human rights in the country. And many of them, in fact, reported that equality was the human right that was the least respected in our country. When one thinks about the question of gender-based violence, then, of course, the fact that less than half of the women in South Africa are aware of the fact that there is an equality clause in the Constitution and that they are entitled to be treated as equals, one can then understand why we have such high levels of gender-based violence, in which the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women has actually said that in South Africa, violence against women has become normalized. Now, the questions in the survey were workshopped with a number of stakeholders in the country. It was based on the Stats South Africa Harmonization of Statistics study. And of course, we also agreed to cover a number of democracy questions in the survey as well. This was also translated into all 11 official languages. We ensured that all of the people who went out to do the survey were able to do the back translations, and very novel for South Africa. Those who were carrying out the survey actually carried mobile devices with computer-based software, which allowed them to upload the questionnaires and their responses very, very quickly. There were 95 questions in all. With the way in which the study was done, now, it never lasted longer than 45 minutes because of the kind of fatigue people have. In terms of demographic information, it interviewed households, and what we had to do was remove all of the interviews which were done with people who were under the age of 18. If you look at the sampling framework, it gives you a sense of all the places in the country where these interviews were actually carried out. In terms of our observations, you will agree that so many years after the Constitution was created, the fact that the levels of awareness of not only the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the Chapter 9 institutions is still alarmingly low. The knowledge of the Constitution obviously is lowest in marginalized and vulnerable communities, and this is really where people most need protection. And so what we have is an incredibly rich sample, but where we really need to look at how we improve levels of awareness in the country. So in terms of the question of who we reached a large number of people, and we were able to determine that at least 82% of all adults live in formal housing. At the same time, we also assessed that 1 in 10 adults lived in informal housing. When you look at the question of access to toilets, this is quite a problematic figure because while 4/5 of all adults in South Africa have access to what is called, and I would say that in inverted commas, improved sanitation, that includes what we call chemical toilets and, of course, ventilated pit latrines as well as flush toilets. And to be very frank, at least 12% of the population have access to none. And I think that you can see from when you move around South Africa what kind of conditions people actually live in. When it comes to the question of water, then while 9 out of every 10 adults in South Africa has access to piped water, with at least 52% of that number living in houses where there is access to piped water. Sadly, at least 48% in South Africa don't have access to any kind of piped water, and in fact they have access to water in terms of streams, dams, springs, or they fetch water, as we've been seeing in the Western Cape, or they receive water through tankers. In terms of electricity, this is the one area where if you live in a formal dwelling, at least 92% of most adults have access to electricity for lighting. But sadly, a very staggering figure is around the question of refuse disposal. And if you look at the fact that 2/3 of the respondents lived in households where their refuse was collected at least once a week, at least 31% didn't have the same kind of access. And in fact, 3% saw that refuse was removed less often, 2% had to take their refuse to communal spaces, 27% had to find their own dumping spots, and 5% really didn't have any place to go to. So to be very frank, when one looks at these kind of lived poverty statistics, one does see that life after 22 years in South Africa has improved for many, but actually for a vast majority, not really. And so when one looked at what we call the Lived Poverty Index, which was developed by Afrobarometer, the survey actually found that one could talk about 15% of adults in South Africa being termed extremely poor. And more than that, when one looked at these figures from a racial perspective, then of course the figures go up alarmingly high. And it's not a secret that if you're either white or you Indian, your conditions are not that badly off. But if you are colored or if you are African, then of course these figures are fairly alarming. And so when one looks at how people feel about the Constitution, the one finding that is quite staggering is that obviously your faith in the ability of the Constitution and constitutional mechanisms to change your life are very much related to where you live and how you experience poverty in our country. When people were actually asked the question, have you heard of either the Constitution or the Bill of Rights? 49% said no, or they were unsure, and another 51% confirmed that they'd heard either of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. When it came to the question of democracy and human rights, again, the figures reveal how South Africans feel about these issues. 39% of those interviewed said they're not satisfied at all with the way in which democracy works. 29% said we're slightly satisfied. 24% were slightly more ambivalent. And only 18% of those interviewed said they were very satisfied with how democracy actually works. Respondents were also asked to clarify which statement best described how they felt about democracy. Half of them thought that democracy was the most preferable form of government, 51% of them, and I think that's encouraging. A quarter, or 26% of them, stated that in some circumstances a non-democratic government can be preferable. And I think here, this is quite problematic because one has to then delve into the questions around why people feel that way. And the remaining quarter, and when we looked at the remaining quarter in terms of a lived poverty index, then obviously when you're really scrounging around or you're in a survivalist mode, it is not surprising that 23% felt that it didn't really matter to them what kind of government we had in South Africa, because for them it hasn't actually worked. In terms of attitudes to the Constitution, another question that was asked is, are things getting better or are things getting worse? 47% of all South Africans felt that it's getting worse. 26% said it's getting better. And 27% of people felt that this was just very much the same. The interesting thing, though, is when we ask the question, is the Constitution the best that South Africa could have? 69% of those interviewed said always. Another 64% felt often, best it could be. 61% didn't really matter, and 60% didn't feel that this was important to them. But I think what we found most interesting is when we looked at this by race and age. When one looks at the question of race groups, for what one would call Black Africans, in the age group between 18 and 19, they were the ones who were the most encouraged about the Constitution. And those figures then vary for other race groups. If one looks at the age group around 70 years old, if one looks at Asians or Indians and white people, then of course this is where I think the most disgruntlement actually lies. Another question that we asked is, we dealt with the question of discrimination. And here, many male respondents said that they had been discriminated they experienced discrimination in a way that was far more than their female counterparts. And this is certainly what the survey did show. 24% were said to have experienced discrimination in the workplace, and with female respondents, they were more likely, 29% of them, than their male counterparts, to have experienced discrimination. And guess where that happens? At home. In terms of the workplace, 36%. In terms of home for males, 22%. In terms of females, 24%. And at home, 29%. But what was very interesting was looking at the questions of respondents speculating on why they thought the discrimination had taken place. And almost 45% of them talked about race being the biggest factor for discrimination, while a further quarter, 27% of them, cited language as being the determining factor around discrimination. Another big question was, of course, attitudes to gender. And not surprisingly, in a very patriarchal country, there were a number of questions that were asked. One of them was, can a man beat his partner if she annoys him? And of course, even though there was a large number, at least half of them saying they disagree with that statement, there were at least 33 who kind of were ambivalent. And there was a group, I think one would say about 16%, who said, we strongly agree that a man can beat his wife. When one looked at this notion of the primary role for childcare is for women, again, startlingly, the figures are quite high, where 33 and I think say they agree, and another 14% say they strongly agree. And so if one adds that up, you're looking at 47% of the population seeing women's role as being for childbearing. Another interesting question, and when you look at sexual violence in our country, a question that one asked is, can married women refuse sex to their husbands? And here, when one looks at the graph, it goes the other way, with 31% agreeing that, yes, women can refuse, another 27% saying that they strongly agree. And I think that's interesting because it does point to the development of the way in which attitudes have changed over time. An important question, I think, in terms of the gender equality question, are women as capable as men to head companies? And here, 39% said we agree, and another 39% said we strongly agree. And so from that perspective, I think gender attitudes in the country have changed. A very controversial question was, of course, the question of sexuality and sex. Here people were asked again to look at the question of the freedom to choose and express sexual orientation. People were asked to say what they felt without fear or judgment. And a second statement people had is whether being gay or lesbian is against the values of the community. Interestingly here, on this one, 68% of all respondents agreed that people in South Africa are free to choose and express their sexual orientation without fear or judgment. And I think that's a big move forward. 74% of those interviewed disagreed or strongly disagreed that being gay or lesbian is against the values of the community. And that does mean that there has been some change in the country in terms of dealing with the question of gender and, of course, sexual orientation. Another important slide that I didn't include was this question of access to the internet in South Africa. This is a big problem in South Africa, and if one thinks about the fact that in the rest of the world they are talking about the fourth technological revolution, in South Africa only 48% of all South Africans have access to the internet either via their phone or a tablet. 17% of our population go to an internet cafe or they go to a public Wi-Fi hotspot where they're able to access the internet. But when one looks at rural areas, more than 46% of South Africans had no access, 46% have no access, and when one looks at rural areas, 61% of people living in rural areas have no access to Wi-Fi or the internet. And if you look at the way in which we communicate in South Africa, I think that's a big problem. Another important statistic was around the question of where do people get their information from? Who do they trust? Interestingly, most people said they get their information from communities, at community meetings, and from community leaders, or they get it from television or community radio. So these questions, there were 95 in total. They were done across the 9 provinces, 24,000, more than 24,000 households, all done on race, sex, and gender. And what we have done with the survey is we have asked a number of researchers to look further and deeper into the data, because you can actually pull the data in terms of race and poverty demographics, making a big difference. And I think that will assist us to really look at the question of where we target constitutional education. Interestingly enough, the survey also revealed that most adults, particularly in rural areas, learned about the Constitution from children at schools. Many of them felt that they couldn't take up their rights issues because they really didn't believe that anybody would do anything about them. Another frightening statistic was the question of the Chapter 9 institutions. Even when you name them, less than 40% of South Africans knew what these institutions were about and who they, in fact, represented and where these issues could be taken up. Very different if you ask them by name. Do they know Thuli Madonsela? Most South Africans know who Thuli Madonsela is, and most know that she will take up their rights issues. But for the rest of the Chapter 9s, I think we have a major problem. So thank you very much. Open to questions.
You want to just have a seat over there. Yeah. Do we have a mic for Yasmin? If you can do that, please. And again, we've got time for 3 questions, okay? So it's again like fastest first. There we are. Let's get, and they all seem to be seated together, I think, yeah. Can we get the mics over there? 1, 2, in front there. Okay, is there another person? We'll just take 3 questions because we need to just make up time. All right, you guys can decide. Go ahead.
Maureen Rowland, Christian Development Trust. Thank you for the presentation. I think it could be reliably argued that people who are aware of the Constitution, and certainly those who understand the Constitution, would tend to feel more empowered in terms of their life, their lifestyles, and so on. So isn't that a strong argument for, if you think in terms of liaising with the Education Ministry, there is, in the curriculum, there is life orientation, life skills, and so surely the Constitution ought to become an important part of that syllabus. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. We can do that, well, you'll make a note of it then, right? Okay, let's get the second one then. No. And then if there's the third person, just raise your hands. If not, we'll move on.
I just want to reaffirm that question exactly, because your point is those who claim to know something, they say they heard it from their children from school. I think this is a wonderful opportunity, and your foundation, my question directly is, what can your Foundation do together with the SACC to advocate for the inclusion of the Constitution and civic education in life orientation?
Okay, thank you. I don't think we have a third person. It's fine, we'll move on. Go ahead.
Thank you. I think both of those are very good questions. And one of the things that we are doing is we have developed an 18-part animation series which actually deals with the Constitution from the question of origins, but also taking into account all of the different rights and also the way in which the courts have and their decisions have impacted on those rights. We have already done quite a big sampling of the animation series with different schools and different school learners in many different demographic areas. And one of the things we're in discussion with the Department of Basic Education is how we can actually take the animation series and air it on the educational television platform, but also how this can be used in schools. Each episode is 2 minutes long. So, you know, and what we've arranged is it's possible to download it on your phone. It's been done in different languages. We also have an educator's manual where we're going to be training teachers across the country on how to use the series and, in fact, to stimulate discussion amongst learners. And the other thing we've done is we've developed a radio program that, in fact, will also you know, play these series and then invite conversations. So, in fact, I think we want to distribute this as widely across the country as possible, and we're happy to do that with the SACC. We already formed, you know, there is a platform on promoting constitutional education in the country. It's meant to be steered by the South African Human Rights Commission, but it also brings a number of players together. And we think that the SABC, as the national public broadcaster, should actually play clips between programs they run. So this is the one way in which we think we can really raise levels of awareness, because there's no doubt that when you actually begin to drill deeper into the survey, people only take up their issues if they feel that somebody else is going to listen to them, or if they know where they can go to actually access help. If you don't have that, people just say, actually, who's going to listen to me? And this was the predominant view, particularly in rural areas and amongst farm workers and domestics. So this is one way in which we think we can make a difference. There's another program that we support, and that's called the National Moot Court for Schools. As of this year, it's become compulsory in every school for every child who is a learner in, I think it's grade 11 and 12, they have to write an essay on the moot court question. And then, of course, you have provincial rounds of the moot, and then in terms of the national moot, this is run with Pretoria University and, of course, the Constitutional Court judges who actually sit and hear children arguing their cases. This has happened on an annual basis, but this is the first year that every school learner has to do the essay as well, because that has become part of the curriculum. The one question we have raised is, should this be part of life orientation, or should the Constitution, in fact, be a proper subject in the curriculum? We think it should, but this is the debate that we're also having with the department.
Okay, if there was a referendum and ask me, Constitution is a subject, then my vote is yes. Okay, and you may want to consider using influencers and their social media platforms to push out animation. And I'm very happy if you tag me regularly around the animated stuff to push it out all the time.
Yeah.
I feel very, very strongly about that, yeah. Okay, I think you've answered both of those together, right? So thank you for your time.
Thank
Wonderful,
you.
very important presentation, absolutely. Wonderful and scary at the same time.
Thank you. I have to say the kids love the animation. All of the characters were I think they were developed with the help of some of South Africa's sort of really famous artists.
Well, wonderful.
And the kids were quite useful in saying what more we should create. So
well, there we are. As we're well aware of, somebody made the point, how many under 35s are in the room? Long time ago, somebody tweeted. Actually, well, there we are. I don't know. You want to raise your hands? But the bottom line, well, there you are, young at heart. But the bottom line is, in the light of what you said about the children, some of the greatest innovations of the last decade are all from people who are, 20, 30 maximum, maybe even younger. So I've gone on record in the past saying the idea of mentorship, where the older person helps the younger, is fine, but in reality, the reverse mentorship needs to be encouraged. And I'm very happy to be mentored by a 20-year-old Laitiki. I promise you that, because I think they know the way to the future. So taking that point, absolutely. That's Yasmin Suka, from the Foundation for Human Rights, the CEO there. Let's move on now to the next of the presentations, which is going to be done by Judith Favish, who's, amongst many other things, Director for Institutional Planning at UCT, University of Cape Town. And the topic is so topical. On the last day of Mandela Month, it's called the Mandela Initiative. Judith? Certainly looking forward to the Mandela Initiative, as always. I'm sure we all are. Thank you. So we've got 20 minutes, right? And then we'll have maybe 3 questions. Well, we will. We get the backup, okay? Did you want a laptop?
There should be a presentation outside.
I think they'll organize it. Let's get that 1 second.
Do you think you could just move that so I can actually see what the slides are? If you just move the banner. Yeah. So good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to start by thanking you for the opportunity to share the recommendations of the Mandela Initiative. I want to start with 2 disclaimers. Firstly, I'm not a professor. And second of all, I'm no longer at the University of Cape Town's planning department. I'm a retiree. And I have been a member of the Mandela Initiative Secretariat, which was charged with organizing or facilitating a national initiative on grappling with poverty and inequality. Sorry. The key question which the initiative was grappling with was wanting to try and understand why has it not proved possible to give effect to the rights in the South African Constitution as quickly as people had hoped and expected. And the identification of this question arose after a national conference which took place in 2012 called the Carnegie 3. And that conference was attended by about 600 people, academics, members of government and civil society, where it became very clear that whilst there had been progress in some areas, in other areas there had been very, very little progress, and in fact in some areas things had got worse. Hence this question was set for the Mandela Initiative. So what was the Mandela Initiative? The Mandela Initiative was coordinated by a national think tank which consisted of about 34 people drawn from different sections of society, from academics, from researchers, several of the vice-chancellors from a couple of the universities were part of it, people from different levels of government. The bishop himself was on the think tank. And there were also members of NGOs and a couple of individuals, and 34 people in all who were charged with facilitating the processes of trying to answer that big question. For some time after the think tank was actually set up, there were discussions with the Nelson Mandela Foundation to partner with them around the initiative. A very important part of the methodology of the initiative was to generate responses to the questions and to generate ideas about how to address the problems that were surfacing across the country by drawing on the experiences of people on the ground, members of local communities, people involved in NGOs, as well as through and to that end, 24 action dialogues were convened across the country with multiple stakeholders around particular focus areas. And those action dialogues were very critical in really trying to develop a very good understanding of how multidimensional poverty was being experienced across the country, but also to try and surface examples of innovative practices that had emerged through people's own collective agency to change their realities. There were also contributions which were drawn from the 8 research chairs who were on the think tank itself, but they also draw in their own networks. And in the end, we had about 40 contributions from researchers across the country on a number of different themes. It was always envisaged that there would be 2 phases to the initiative. The first initiative would be research-based, the first phase, sorry. And in the second phase, we would be trying to facilitate national conversations around the outcomes of the initiative. And so the culmination of the research work, if you like, was a national conference which took place in February, again with the participation of multiple stakeholders from across the country to engage with the draft recommendations, to give feedback and suggestions. That report is now currently being consolidated. It's not absolutely finalized yet. So you can't really see that very well, but I think the presentations that we've already heard this morning have really highlighted the stark fact that to a very large extent, the structural inequalities which characterized our country under apartheid remain embedded in most of the aspects of our society. And what those 2 circles do is they counterpose the data that has surfaced recently on wealth, and particularly the fact that 10% of people in this country own 95% of the wealth, and that is counterposed with high levels of unemployment, high levels of poverty, stunting, low levels of education, etc., all of which we have really touched on already today. So I'm not going to repeat those. But the important question is, why? So when we asked the various contributors to prepare their inputs, and as they approached their research, we really wanted to know how does structural inequality manifest in the particular focus area that you're working in? What do you think are the main reasons why structural inequality continues to be so pervasive in South Africa? What ideas do you have for addressing that? And how do you think those would impact on eliminating structural inequalities and poverty in South Africa? So firstly, clearly, a large and the most significant reason is the fact that our colonial and apartheid history, which has continued to impact on the way in which our society is structured today. But it's also important to look at the policy choices that have been made since democracy to try and understand whether, in addition, whether the reasons for the lack of progress could also be related to poor policy choices, incorrect policy choices, poor implementation of policies. And what the research has identified and surfaced very clearly is a number of choices that have been made across different focus areas that have really served to perpetuate structural inequality in South Africa. So if you look on the left-hand side, what that slide is trying to illustrate is that in terms of people's ability to access opportunities for developing their own capabilities for becoming and acting as productive citizens, the household is the critical site for reproducing structural inequality, but also very importantly, where people live, obviously, and whether they have access to employment clearly impacts on their ability to access education and health. So what we need to really be trying to look at is not only the structural factors arising from our apartheid and colonial legacy, but we also need to look very critically at some of the policy choices that have been made. So I've been asked not to focus so much on the diagnosis or the underlying drivers for perpetuating structural inequalities and poverty, but rather to focus on the recommendations that came from the various work streams, the action dialogues, the research, and then finally from the National Conference. So the first is the underpinning drivers for eliminating structural inequalities and poverty. And what we're suggesting here is that very importantly, we need to start by facilitating national conversations around a new national vision. And hence, gatherings like this are absolutely critical, because it's that vision and the framework for the kind of society that we want to see that should actually be informing the nature of the policies that we want to implement in order to achieve that vision. There's also been general agreement that if you look at the stark realities of inequality that we've been talking about so far this morning, we can't just focus on issues of corruption or issues on poor capacity within the state. We have to really look at the need to send very strong signals, or what some people in the National Conference referred to as the need for disruptive measures in order to ensure that we move ahead with very different set of priorities that would address issues of inequality and poverty. And we need to stand back and say that means that some of the policies that had been regarded pretty much as conventional, as orthodox policies around thinking about issues of growth, we need to question those, and we need to be open to thinking about more heterodox approaches, and very importantly, we need to think out of the box. So a number of ideas came up around generating inclusive growth, with a particular focus on ensuring that the most marginalized sections of the society would benefit from redistribution. And the first was to try and link various aspects of people's realities together and to use interventions in those spaces to contribute to growth. So one would be greater investment in the urban landscape, and to do it in a way that would generate employment, but also in a way that, later on you'll see, I'll talk more about it, that breaks the historical spatialized apartheid configurations. We need an investment-led recovery, which would require faster credit extension and longer-term leading to enable a massive investment in changing and building a new approach to the urban landscape. We need measures to support vulnerable workers to accompany the minimum wage. We need more mechanisms to support employment of young people. And here there's been a suggestion that given the high incidence of youth unemployment in South Africa, we simply cannot go forward unless we really say that this must be one of our #1 challenges. And in that regard, there's some thinking about the possibility of a guaranteed employment program for young people, or at the very least, a massive extension of the current youth employment incentive scheme to cover all vulnerable workers. That household income support should run on twin tracks, involving both cash transfers, which we currently have in place, as well as basic employment assurance, and I'm going to talk more about that later on. There was a feeling also that South Africa can be very insular, and even our conversations within the Mandela Initiative have tended to be very South African focused and relatively less so on what we can learn from other countries in the rest of the continent and how we can ensure that we go forward in a more integrated way. There was a strong emphasis, in line with focusing on inequality, on the need for more intrusive competition policy and pro-competition interventions, including interrogating the role of banks in perpetuating the status quo. To protect and enhance the informal sector and the township economies, there's been a view that our present government has been very ambiguous about the informal economies, and as a result, their attitude or the way in which they've engaged with the informal sector has tended to waver between compliance on the one hand and also trying to facilitate on the other hand, but not a very clear statement about the need to recognize the different ways in which people are trying to generate livelihoods themselves. To maximize the potential for employment creation through sustainable energy policies, as well as the need to look at fiscal and financial reform to raise additional revenue, including the issue of the possibility of a wealth tax, which people feel needs to be debated and discussed as part of these national conversations going forward. So what we've tried to do is not to come up with recommendations that cover absolutely everything. The idea was to really try and surface priorities. So the next suggested priority was based on a belief that whilst education in and of itself will not generate employment or will not necessarily change the conditions under which people live, without improved education, it's difficult to remove social inequalities. So there's a recommendation that a national campaign be launched, focused on trying to ensure that every child should be able to read by the end of grade 3, and that would require mass mobilization at local level in order to do this, because many of the examples of good practice across the country have highlighted the critical role of volunteers and the involvement of carers in trying to assist with achieving improvements in reading. And a view that we need to learn as we plan for such a campaign from big campaigns that we've already mounted, for example, in relation to HIV/AIDS. But obviously, in order to achieve that goal, we need to address the constraints impacting on the attainment of this goal, which the researcher suggested included things like the capacity of provinces to support schools, dealing with the power of the unions, which I know many people feel is quite controversial, and then very critically focusing on the content knowledge of teachers. But what has also surfaced very strongly is the need to review the current language policy. Currently, children are required to learn in English from grade 4. And there are many people who feel that this is inappropriate and it's having a significant impact on the ability of children to master literacy skills, which are the basis for further learning, and that should be reviewed. There isn't currently a rural education policy, and yet we all know that rural schools in South Africa face particular challenges, and people have suggested that's a gap that needs to be addressed. The post-provisioning model at the moment serves to perpetuate inequalities, in that the provision that was made for governing bodies from the ex-Model C schools to be able to charge fees and use that income to appoint additional teachers or to increase the salaries for teachers, whilst it may have been done in order to try and democratize, part of democratizing school governance, the fact is that even though the government has introduced no fee-paying schools, that doesn't compensate for the growing inequality that affects our schooling system as a result of the paying of fees, and that affects things like resources and posts, where we know that in most township schools, administrative teachers are having to perform huge administrative jobs, which in the more resourced schools are performed by administrators. So the need to really look again at the post-revisioning model with a view to redressing those imbalances in resources, as well as the actual funding model that has had the effect of perpetuating a bimodal education system. And very importantly, and I think we've just seen evidence of that, the need to look more critically at the role of education in promoting social justice. So we've said those two areas, the education and the combination of strategies for promoting inclusive, redistributive growth, are underpinnings for anything else that needs to be done. They are absolutely critical. But there are also a number of strategies that are needed in order to arrest intergenerational poverty. You can't separate these things completely because clearly they're linked, but they give you a sense of possible ways in which we can prioritize the introduction of new policies and new initiatives. So firstly, there's a suggestion that although the provision of ECD has expanded, it is not enough. And what we really need to do as a country is prioritize the first 1,000 days of a child's life, because research has shown the damage that is done to children, particularly as a result of stunting or as a result of not having had access to preschool education or adequate nutrition, is permanent. So in order to prevent that, we need to, as a country, say we're going to do like what Brazil did, and we're going to prioritize the first 1,000 days of a child's life. And that means we need to set a national goal to eliminate stunting. We already have an integrated early childhood development policy. Let's implement it. Let's set clear targets and timelines towards full implementation by 2030. And let's draw on successful examples, because one of the things that's bedeviled the provision of ECD up until now is the fact that different aspects of ECD have been provided by different departments, or they've been provided at different levels of government, and then also with NGOs and government not really collaborating. So there's a whole range of things that stem from that kind of fragmentation, whereas actually the examples of good practice show that what is really needed is a holistic, integrated approach. Let me just go one step further. Earlier on I spoke about the government's ambiguous attitude towards the informal sector. So the ECD area is a really good example of this, where on the one hand we're recognizing that ECD is important. The TVET colleges are now training significant numbers of ECD practitioners across the country. But then what is happening is people's efforts to start creches are being hampered because they're being told they don't comply with the regulatory requirements. So people are saying, let's rather adopt a more flexible approach that helps people move towards compliance rather than insisting on compliance, because this is also a critical way of generating livelihood. Sorry. Sorry, how do I go back here? Yeah. So developing a comprehensive social security program. Earlier on, there was some mention about the fact that if you're an unemployed young person in a rural area, and you're over the age you're older than the age for which you qualify for a grant. If you need to access information about where jobs are, or if you need to go and try and use the internet somewhere, you need money. You need money to access internet, you need money for transport, you need money to pay for applications. And so people are beginning across this area. There have been a number of youth dialogues, and there's a youth national network. And what they have put on the table is the idea of a basic package for youth support that serves youth's needs across different ages based on a life stage approach. They've also talked about the need for more data, informed interventions, that strategies, when we're thinking about education and training, should go beyond thinking about the formal economy, but also linked to supporting the solidarity economy, and that we need to be looking at different stages when the children are leaving grade 9 or grade 12 or exiting a qualification, what kind of support needs to be in place in order to strengthen what we're trying to do. Post-school planning, I'm not going to have time to go through that in detail, but the strategies have really focused on what needs to be done in order to enhance the responsiveness of TVET colleges. But there's a strong emphasis on trying as a country to say, we can't just be focusing on saying there's a mismatch between the needs of the formal economy and what the TVET institutions are actually offering in terms of training. Because many of our young people will not get jobs in the formal labour market. The formal labour market is not producing enough jobs to absorb them all. We need to be looking much more critically at the role that TVET colleges can play in terms of building and strengthening the solidarity economy, cooperatives, etc. And again, there are amazing examples around the country of how we can reflect on those examples and try and embed some of those elements in the formal education and training system. Other strategies to overcome inequality. We talked a little bit about the need for advancing spatial transformation, but here there's also a proposal that what we've tended to do up until now is build RDP houses on the periphery of our cities. And that perpetuates the spatial apartheid configuration of our landscape. We need to stop that, and that was quite a strong recommendation. We need to focus much more, as part of the land debate, on releasing land which can be used for medium density housing in urban areas, because that also enables access to opportunities for people to develop other capabilities. And there are various other changes that we've suggested around the misalignments between different levels of government, as well as improving the subsidy and increasing rental housing stock, and then also trying to ensure that there's communication with transport. The key thing with this approach is also suggesting that rather than sitting with your stratified departments doing different things, is to focus on particular places, particular urban areas, release the land, and try and develop ways of delivering services that are much more integrated and holistic. Reconfiguring the land reform policies. Again, it's not possible to go into those in great detail. The people who were part of the Mandela Initiative were also quite active in the high-level panel that was chaired by the former president, Kgalema Motlanthe, and broadly speaking, there was a lot of support from the various action dialogues for the recommendations of the high-level panel. Other things that surfaced were opportunities for job creation, in particular agricultural sectors. But here there was really a strong view that we hadn't been able to move forward, largely because of the policy choices that were made and the poor implementation. Addressing pay inequality, I want to spend a minute or two on this, because many of us in the debates leading up to conversations like this, the debates have tended to focus on poverty and on poor people. And what the initiative is really saying is, if we're going to go forward as a country, we really also have to focus on wealth and we have to focus on privilege. And in addition to thinking about issues like the wealth tax, we also need to be looking at ways in which we can try and regulate pay at the top end of the pay scale, as whilst we're also trying to ensure that a regime of protecting the rights of the most marginalized are introduced. Health services, it was largely, again, highlighting problems with different misalignment, different levels of government, also highlighting inequalities across provinces. And hence, this was one area where, at a funding level, it was felt that the funding should be centralized at a national level, whereas the delegation of authority should be delegated to the local level where decisions are being made. I'm not going to go into that. Social cohesion, there was a view that it really is not possible to achieve without tackling the structural inequalities that undermine the human dignity of the majority of our citizens. And we really needed to ensure that there's an acknowledgement, find ways of getting the privileged sections of our society to acknowledge their privilege and how they've been enriched, and to get to express a willingness to work together with others. So I'm not going to have time to look at that. The last slide, I keep saying I'm not having time to look at it, but the second last slide is doing different things and doing things differently. So we've talked about the fact that we need to make different kinds of policy choices. We need a reprioritization. We also need to look at government, empowering government to work in different ways, in ways that are actually empowering and supportive of local initiatives, and that also are open to working in intersectoral and coordinated ways. And then the last slide is reflections. So the Mandela Initiative Phase 1, we feel what we've achieved is being able to foreground inequality. There's some suggestions. Developed. There's still the danger that we will proceed in a fragmented way, whereas what we're needing to do is proceed in a much more coherent and focused way. Is what we produced, is the whole bigger than the parts? Well, we think that there's more work to be done. And we think particularly the work on looking at the intersections between the different focus areas needs to be picked up. But obviously these are just ideas. And unless these ideas become embedded in the work and activities of organizations and civil society, they will remain at the level of the ideas. So the second phase at the moment, the Nelson Mandela Foundation is facilitating national conversations around two of these areas. ECD is one, and they're also contributing to the various dialogues around land. But for the rest, the Mandela Initiative as it was has ended. And the idea is to really get these outcomes out and circulated and embedded in other discussions. For people who are interested in more information, mandelainitiative.org is where you will find many of the reports, the contributions by the individual researchers, and the reports of the action dialogues. Thank you.
Right, there we are.
Sorry.
If you can have a seat. You want which one? Okay, fine. All right. Okay, thank you for that. Again, just so many interesting things coming out of that, right? But we've got time for 3 questions and short, sharp ones so we can move on, right? Again, raise your hands. One, let's get others. Who else has got a mic? Okay, if you can start up first and then maybe one other person. So 1, 2, and 1 third one. If we don't have that, we'll move on. Go ahead.
Again, Maureen Rowland, Christian Development Trust. Particularly if you think in terms of generational poverty, and I do realize you couldn't cover everything in your presentation, but I was very surprised that you didn't touch on the issue of school children, schoolgirls, who become pregnant, especially in the 12 to 16-year-old age group. Not only is this a high figure, but it has been increasing. So it's not something that's going to go away. And of course, that also has impacts on HIV/AIDS as well. So it's really the issue of schoolgirls who become pregnant and then obviously don't have the emotional or the physical ability or structural ability to be able to handle that. And this obviously affects their life going forward.
Okay, got that. Thank you. You can answer that.
I'd prefer to.
You want the... Okay, just pass, if you can bring that along here, because we won't go back there, right? Okay, leave that for Yasmin. If you can just bring that along here to the front. You could have used the mic.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you can. You certainly can. There we are.
Okay, so just two responses to that. The first is that there was a very strong emphasis on people generating priorities for intervention. So not trying to deal with absolutely every problem in each of the focus areas, but to deal with what they thought were the absolute critical areas in which there should be interventions. Hence, in the education space, there was a focus on this national reading campaign and on the language policy as mechanisms for unlocking a range of other things. But with regard to your pregnancy question, one of the things that the critiques that was made of the TVET colleges, as I said earlier, was that they're not sufficiently responsive to the needs of people who are not in the formal labour market, who are not in employment, who are not in education, but who would need some form of education and training in order to help them deal with the issues that they might be confronting in their circumstances at the time, and also to change those. And that includes a stronger focus on pregnant young people who will maybe never go back to school. But my own feeling is that in the education chapter, there's a lot more work that needed to be done, particularly on the role of education in promoting social justice, with the focus on the curriculum and the extent to which the curriculum has really enabled us to prepare the next generation for building a more equitable social order.
Okay, thank you for that. Roger, you can go ahead. Got that? Otherwise, can we let's just swap it? Maybe let Yasmin just let's just do this. Hold it. All right. Is that working on that side? It's not working. Okay.
Thank you. Aldred Genade, Northwest University again. Is insularity such a negative thing? Should we be apprehensive about insularity? I'm thinking of the Hiroshima event, a nation flattened, and how it has managed to insulate and rebuild from within, and at the risk of being misunderstood, the capacity of the apartheid government, when the whole world was against them, when they was nevertheless able to build a country for their own selfish purposes, understood. But they managed to do what I think some of our current leaders have not been able to do. And so I'm just asking, are there lessons we could learn from, maybe not just from the Orient, but from other emerging economies, of how they have managed to, in 25 years, accomplish a whole lot more than what we have been able to accomplish?
Okay, got that. Thank you. Right, go ahead.
Yes, I wasn't one of the researchers. My role was really to try and help put together the report. But I think the point that this particular researcher was making is that increasingly, if we look across the world, economies are increasingly being structured on a regional basis. And in that sense, he was challenging us, particularly South Africans, because of apartheid and having been more insular, that we needed to question our own thinking. You know how many people we still hear in this country saying they're going into Africa, and you say you can't go into Africa, you are already in Africa. So you've got to consciously try and think as a geographical area that is connected in many ways to the economy, but in ways that would actually benefit all of us. If we were able to collaborate more and agree on things that would enable all of our economies to grow more, there would be benefits for all of us.
Okay, thank you. And you've got a mic there, the last one, right?
Thank you. I mean, my question relates to 2 points that you raised. The one is of education, and the other one is around economic choices. Now, many graduates in South Africa, particularly young black graduates, actually don't have jobs once they qualify. And I think as we're producing more people for employment, in fact, our market has not really adapted to take that on board. But another thing that is really changing is the question of employment and the protection of what used to be a permanent employee. And if one looks at the recent Constitutional Court decision, which is dealing with who's your real employer, the labor broker, or the person that the labor broker services, and while the judgment is quite useful that if you're employed for more than 3 months, then you become an employee of the outfit that employs you rather than the labor broker. I mean, this has consequences for a country where even being a member of a union is really a privilege. And I just wonder how we begin to reconcile the fact that as the rest of the world is undergoing a technological transformation, our workers are not preparing for the fact that robots are going to replace them, and artificial intelligence is even replacing people at a much higher academic level.
I mean, again, that's a very interesting question, and I think it highlights critically some of the challenges in the current discourse that dominates the way in which we think about the TVET sector particularly. Because correctly, many people are concerned about the changing nature of work and the implications down the road, or even very nearly down the road, of the fourth industrial revolution. And it is correct that education and training institutions need to take that challenge seriously. But equally, I think what this report has tried to highlight is that there are 11 million unemployed people. And those 11 million people are not likely to get jobs in the formal sector. And so what we need as a country to be thinking about in relation to particularly the TVET colleges is at a point when somebody's going to leave the college, we send them out. Whereas the examples of good practice across the country suggest that at that point there needs to be engagement and discussions with the graduates who's about to leave. Some would have got employment, others wouldn't have. It's to actually sit with those who haven't got and to look at ways in which they can be supported to find other ways of generating livelihoods. Or in many of our rural colleges, they are training students for jobs that simply don't exist in those areas, whereas actually there's a lot of evidence of growing cooperatives which are being formed, where it would be perhaps more suitable, instead of having to follow this national curriculum rigidly in ways that are not responsive to local needs, is to say, what are people themselves? What opportunities are they developing? And how can these colleges provide programs that are likely to give them the skills and so on to enable them, those co-ops, to grow and flourish? So, yes, I absolutely agree with you.
All right, and that's where we're going to leave it. Judith Pavish, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it from the Mandela Initiative. As you said, it's closed now, but the report is certainly available. Thank you so much for that. I mean, just two things. That point about insularity, whether it's sustainable, whether it's not so bad. I think the bigger question is it ever sustainable? Are there countries, are there nations that have been insular, that have been able to then sustain that beyond 20 years, or what? If that's the case, we'd love to know. The other one around, I thought it was interesting about you bringing up artificial intelligence, because you're from the Human Rights Commission, which means there could well be an Artificial Rights Commission, something along that line, down the line. I don't know who's going to start it. I'm just saying I can certainly see that. Just quick thought, you know, in the old days, you'd say something is fashionable. What's the new phrase for being in fashion or fashionable is? You're trending, right, or trendy. So the good news on social media, we are trending, and that is thanks to all of you. Because many people, thank you, many people have tweeted starting from their pictures to "we are here" or "I am here," and they've quoted extensively, they've asked questions, and others have retweeted that. So great that you've done that, which means even beyond today, continue doing that, because it doesn't stop trending at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock. You can ask questions even when you go home and see who's saying what, okay? It's really important. We don't have much more to go today. We'll get to the book launch after the break just now. But let me bring you on to an important part. So you may have seen a series around themes, and that was played out from Convening SA on, well, driven through social media, in particular Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, and through their live streams, okay? And who's seen that? Raise your hands. Who's been following it? Not enough people, clearly. We need far more. So let me tell you, and that's where I got involved. The 4 themes were debated in 4 straight weeks, and these themes were put together from last year, in fact. Very, very important, significant themes, and then debated over the last 4 weeks, and they were played out live on social media. So you can go Facebook Live or Twitter Live and YouTube, and you'll find it even now, and then share it with other people as well. They're all in 1-hour packages. They're really fascinating and important, because some of the major players that are seated here and who will be here tomorrow were part of that. So do check that out. So with that in mind, let me tell you what comes up next. Those themes that I speak about, they are anchoring democracy, is one of the themes. The other one is healing and reconciliation. The other is economic transformation. And the fourth one is comprehensive quality education. So those were the 4 main themes discussed, right? And the plan is we'll get 4 people coming up now to give us a 10-minute preview, because they've been part of workshops, they've been moderating these discussions over the last few months, in fact. So they're going to give you this preview of what they've done, and then looking forward to tomorrow, because tomorrow it's less talking from the platform, but more genuine debate from the panels that will form a part of that. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to call up the 4 people. They'll get seated over here. Each one of the 4 will present for 10 minutes maximum each. That gives us 40 minutes, probably time for 10 minutes of questions thereafter. Then we'll have the coffee or tea break. Then we'll have the, I could say, relaunch of that fabulous book written by Nelson Mandela, in fact, just in terms of his work. So the 4 people in question, Coogan Pillay, if I call your name, if you can come up here, please, it'll be great. Coogan Pillay, who presented on anchoring democracy. Kevin Bloom for healing and reconciliation. Fezeka Stierman for economic transformation, and Dr. Sitle Moon for comprehensive quality education. Give them a big hand, please, all 4 of them. Do we have the 4? Well, 1, 2, 3. Anybody missing? There we are. We've got all 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Right. I'll leave it to you. Who wants to start? Maybe in order of how we have it, which is Coogan Pillay, right? So we can run through the 4, 10 minutes each. And then we'll ask you some questions beyond that. So, yeah, just 10 minutes for each one of you, then some questions, and there could be some questions from the audience as well. Then we'll wrap it up. So I'm going to get off stage, and I'm looking forward to listening to these presentations. Thank you.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Do we have the slides? Sorry, yeah. Okay. Okay, cool. Lovely. Okay. Clearly, we're in the graveyard shift when more than 50% of the seats are empty. But I think the consolation is that they've left after lunch, but they should be here for dinner. So at least we'll have a full house this evening. All right, colleagues, just a little bit of background as to the process. I know you've heard the Bishop and the other colleagues speak about it. But as you can see, the first slide, it talks about the South Africa we pray for. And this was at the height of state capture when the SACC led this process with other multi-faith organizations in terms of the desperation expressed by the vast majority of citizens in terms of what was happening in the country. And incidentally, at the same time, I was also working with the Kgalema Motlanthe Foundation as people were looking for a platform of people that they could count on. And hence the SACC platform, the South Africa we pray for. And subsequently, you may have heard the Kgalema Motlanthe Foundation more recently, about a month ago, had the Drakensberg conference. It's fine, that's fine. So, in November last year, we had the convention, and anchoring democracy was one of the main themes, as you've heard. And under anchoring democracy, there were many sub-themes, such as propagating the Constitution, building state integrity, ensuring the place of participatory citizenship, ensuring appropriate employment of state security systems for the public good, improving the justice system, strengthening the electoral system, and improving oversight role of legislatures. I know you've heard a bit of background earlier, but I just want to give you some background in terms of where the anchoring democracy fits in. And I didn't include the slide, but let me read this to you. This was at the height of state capture, mid-2016, and I will include this later, a statement by President Jacob Zuma in July 2016, where he said, and I quote, "If it were up to me and I made the rules, I would ask for 6 months as a dictator. You would see wonders. South Africa would be straight. That's why if you give me 6 months and allow Zuma to be a dictator, you would be amazed. Absolutely. Everything would be straight. Right now, to make a decision, you need to consult. You need a resolution, a decision, collective petition. Yo, it's a lot of work." Unquote, President Jacob Zuma, July 2016. I also, as some of you might know, also sat on former Public Protector Thuli Madonsela's advisory board. 3 months later, she led the State of Capture report, and she launched that. Another statement from Nelson Mandela in 1996. Again, there's some background. I quote Nelson Mandela, "Our experience had made us acutely aware of the possible dangers of a government that is neither transparent nor accountable. To this end, our Constitution contains several mechanisms to ensure that government will not be part of the problem." Unquote, Nelson Mandela, 1996. So as a bit of that background, and where are we? So you can see my broad themes in terms of the constitutional democracy that was fought for and many of them laid their lives down. And the broad themes are despair, promise, betrayal, hope, reality, and renewal. And if you look at despair, I don't think we want to recall the period prior to 1994, especially the mid-80s, the 70s, and you've heard earlier this week warrant of arrest for Rodriguez, who is accused of murdering Ahmed Timol. And then came 1994, the promise and the period of the Constitution. And I call it the Constitutional Revolution. For the first time in South African history, political and civil rights were accorded to all South Africans, irrespective of race. It marked the end of 300 years of colonialism, segregation, and apartheid, and replaced it with a universal franchise and an electoral system based on proportional representation. The doctrine of parliamentary sovereignty was replaced by the doctrine of constitutional supremacy. A Bill of Rights was put into place to safeguard human rights, ending centuries of state-sanctioned abuse. The strong central government of the past was replaced by a system of government in which legislative and executive powers was divided among national, provincial, and local spheres of government. And then from 94, there were many other pieces of instruments that were used to transform South Africa. In 2012, we had the National Development Plan, which sets out Vision 2030 for reclaiming citizen dignity and social justice through addressing poverty, unemployment, and inequality. As many of you will know, due to the phenomenon of state capture, Vision 2030 currently remains at risk. Stats South Africa in 1994 indicated that South Africa was the most unequal society in the world. 24 years later, in the centenary of Madiba, we remain one of the most unequal societies in the world. This is certainly an indictment against Madiba's legacy. In 2018, Stats SA indicated unemployment at 27% and poverty at 55%. Recently, Oxfam also released a report where they've indicated 1% of people owning wealth equivalent of 99% globally. And in South Africa, less than 10 people owning wealth of more than 50% of the country's resources. And I think this is a recipe for social disaster. Recently, in the month of Madiba, the SAHRC also launched a report on equality. And they've indicated in the last 20 years, the Gini coefficient has improved by 0.2, from 0.7 to 0.67, still remaining a vastly unequal country. Worse still is the Gini coefficient for wealth, which is sitting at 0.95. And this is a recipe for disaster. And the question you ask is, this is obscene wealth. Many of you would have heard President Obama doing the Nelson Mandela lecture. And he said, he's got a lot of money. And he said, you can only eat so much. And I would add, you can only live in so many houses, or you can only drive so many cars. So the question is, why the need for such obscene wealth? And this is certainly not what Madiba had fought for. And then came the game changer in 2017. The election of Cyril Ramaphosa as the new president of the ANC and of South Africa. And then in February 2018 of this year, his State of Nation address, where he's indicated, he's pledged reclaiming the values and principles as enshrined in the Constitution. So just very briefly, before I go into the substreams of the anchoring democracy, again as background. At the SONA, President Ramaphosa immediately committed the country to addressing corruption and state capture by instituting his Judicial Commission of Inquiry and the critical challenges and social sins of poverty, hunger, unemployment, and inequality, which are the key NDP goals to build an inclusive economy and for social cohesion and nation building. President Ramaphosa also recommits the government and the country to the values and principles of the Constitution. And he dedicates 2018 to this marks a new dawn and a period of hope as we remember both Mandela and Sisulu and live and reclaim their values and build a better life for all South Africans. President Ramaphosa called on South Africans to put behind them the period of despair, negativity, disillusionment, and trust in institutions and leadership, and move toward consolidating South Africa's democracy and build a shared future towards prosperity for all, while guided by the ethical behavior and leadership as exemplified by Mandela and Sisulu. President Ramaphosa also alluded to the weakening of institutions and erosion of democracy which need to be rebuilt. He also cited the deterioration of the economy as well as high levels of poverty, unemployment, and inequality. Under Cyril Ramaphosa, the government launched its #Tumamina campaign earlier this year, calling on all South Africans to become involved in community and societal issues facing South Africans and to help build South Africa. President Ramaphosa coined the term Tumamina campaign as part of what he called a new dawn. And this, as the SACC's initiative, is part of that. President Ramaphosa, in his State of Nation address, also commended the role of civil society broadly in exposing corruption and state capture and demanding accountability. So I'll now go into the substreams of anchoring democracy. And the first one is propagating the Constitution. Pretty much, you've also heard background on the Constitution and its values earlier in the day. So I'll try and be brief. And the first one is anchoring South Africa's democracy around the Constitution. And I think many of you do know, but as covered by Yasmin as well earlier, the basic principles which underlie our constitutional order are constitutionalism, the rule of law, democracy, accountability, separation of powers, and checks and balances. And I'll stick to democracy as that is our sub-theme. And democracy is the rule of people within certain predetermined channels according to certain prearranged procedures. The principle of democracy means that citizens are entitled to pressurize the government to give effect to their rights. Chapter 9 of the Constitution creates a number of institutions to support democracy and the separation of powers, such as the South African Human Rights Commission, the Public Protector, and others. Further, the Constitution not only provides for the formulation of the will of the people, but also requires government to respond to the will of the people, which gives rise to the principles of openness, responsiveness, and accountability. So in looking at propagating the Constitution, some of the key aspects that we need to take cognizance of is the recent high-level panel report and study led by former President Kgalema Motlanthe. And the study was essentially assessing the efficacy of the Constitution in transforming South Africa from the previous oppressive, exploitative regime of the apartheid government to the new constitutional democracy that we have. It is also important to look at the role of institutions of the Constitution, namely the Chapter 9s and 10s, Chapter 9 such as the Public Protector, the South African Human Rights Commission, and the Auditor General. As part of the former advisory board member of the Public Protector, and as part of the institution, we also led Good Governance Weeks as part of the institution, and which was a collaborative mechanism to facilitate collaboration between the various Chapter 9s and 10s, which sadly has taken a backseat since exit from the office. Recent events also force us to look at the Constitution. Events and court judgments such as in Nkandla, the SASSA debacle, which was quite embarrassing to have a Concord pronouncing on a minister's job, and then the opportunity for improvement, as former Deputy Chief Justice Dikgang Moseneke included, that there's too much of power, too much of power in the presidency, in terms of the cabinet shuffles we've had, and you've heard Professor Ivor saying this morning we've had about 20 cabinet shuffles in the last 10 years, in the last 9 years of his presidency of Zuma. Also, the judiciary being hijacked for narrow personal gain in terms of the appeal cases that have gone on for the last couple of years. And then lastly, the role of civil society as an active citizenry in collaborating with various institutions. The next sub-theme under anchoring democracy is building state integrity. And I think what's important here is to undo the legacy of state capture. And this could easily be, if I quote former President Kgalema Motlanthe, could be a 5-10-year project. So someone asked the question earlier, how long would it take? And nothing, the bishop said this is a medium to long-term project. But we've already started the undoing with President Ramaphosa's leadership. And such as the... Okay. All right. I've been given 2 more minutes, so I'll try and rush through this. Some of the other initiatives are the commissions of state commissions of inquiry into state capture, appointed by Cyril Ramaphosa under Deputy Chief Justice Zondo, and then the parliamentary inquiry. But it's still necessary to have broader civil society and these SACC-led based initiatives. I'm sure all of you have heard the findings from the parliamentary inquiry, where the subpoenas are basically meaningless. Zuma's son, the Guptas and the former SAA chair have been subpoenaed, and they have not, and the inquiry is being closed up. So I think we need to relook at the enforcement measures and what force it has. Rebuilding of institutions for capacitating the state, and then we have the role of the Public Service Commission as a Chapter 10 body. Ethics and integrity, again, as pronounced by President Ramaphosa, and a recent document on the need for a new moral normative by Professor Zulu. Civil society collaboration. Many of you would have seen the collaboration between Corruption Watch and the Institute of State Security Studies, which have jointly put on procedures for the appointment of the new head of Hawks by bringing in citizen participation. Relooking at apartheid-era instruments, such as the Minister's Handbook, and then also accountability and a zero tolerance. We achieved this during the World Cup when we had speed justice, and it's possible now. Ensuring the place of participatory citizenship. In the last 22 years, I think citizen patience has been tested during the state capture. So that's a positive state capture, so that we try and fix up now while it is still early in our democracy. Many of you might remember the force of civil society in the mid-80s, the UDF, COSATU, which brought the apartheid government to the knees. And I think likewise you saw the resurgence in the last 2 years with state capture. Pressure by civil society broadly, including the SACC initiative to continue the rebuilding of the institutions that have been trashed by state capture. I've mentioned already the collaboration of Corruption Watch as an NGO and the ISS on the appointment procedures. Another important measure is citizen surveys, and to utilize civil society broadly, such as the religious sector, media, women and youth. And then also lifestyle audits, as championed by President Ramaphosa in his State of Nation address. The fourth one out of the 7 is ensuring appropriate employment of state security systems for the public good. During state of capture, the abuse of state organs such as NPA, Hawks, and SARS was for a narrow elite, as opposed to for the broad public good. Capture of these organs for narrow self-interest, greed, versus the broader public good. What we need is absolute integrity and honesty, starting from the president, ministers, and senior officials in government. And again, the vigilance of civil society, as observed during the state of capture. And I've mentioned the collaboration of state, of NGO, Corruption Watch. And then improving the justice system. You've heard already the Constitution and NDP are essentially governance instruments that were supposed to be pro-poor. And access to justice, I contend, and I argue, should be a priority basic right to enable the poor, vulnerable, and marginalized to access other basic socioeconomic rights, such as health, education, food, and shelter. However, the opposite is happening. The hijacking, capture of the judiciary by former president with the endless appeals funded by the citizen while compromising governance and leadership. And then there's abuses in the system by the wealthy and powerful to the detriment of the poor, contrary to the servant leadership that the bishop was talking about. And I'm almost there, Ashraf. The 6th one is strengthening the electoral system. 1994, as you heard Ivor saying, the positives and negative, was a compromise settlement. After 24 years, we have enough, we should have data to evaluate what system works best for us and not works best for the people and not for a political party per se. And we need to look at best practice to ensure service delivery and accountability. And we need to relook at the Van Zyl-Slabbert report, the high-level panel report from former president. And the last sub-theme is improving oversight role of legislators. Given state capture, this is imperative. We've seen Parliament being taken to court on state capture. We've seen the Gauteng province with the saga of e-tolls and Isidimeni. And then we've seen the Western Cape crisis of the DA. And this is toxic politics, which is compromising the citizen. And if I go to, that is the last one. And then the committee members, that I represented are essentially there. These are all the members that belong to this subcommittee. Thank you.
I can go. Do you have a presentation? No, but I can go.
This is to forward the slides, and then the red one is, where's the red? That's to go backwards. How do you switch it on? Yeah, this thing.
You guys. I can go in the meanwhile.
What do you guys mean? I don't have a presentation.
I can go, yeah.
Is the mic on? Is my mic on?
Your mic, well, we can get it on. Yeah, but do you want to go first?
I can go.
You can go first.
No problem.
Okay.
It turns out they do have, Asha.
Do they?
It turns out they do have.
Thank you. All right, I'll meet you.
Okay. I promise to be much briefer than Kuhn. And to do that, I'm going to try and dispense with the preliminaries and go straight to the heart of the matter, which is this. In the last session of the convention, we summarized our purview, our areas of focus into these areas. ECD, again, I'm not going to say much because a lot has been said about it. We focused on the need for the first 1,000 days, extensive investment, and just focusing renewed attention on ECD as a significant starting point to everybody's life, so that the new generation has a new opportunity, a better opportunity. And then the second thematic area is basic education. And in our analysis, we think that the problems we had to deal with fees must fall and so on, have their provenance in ECD, poor ECD, and poor basic education. We think that when you try to resolve these issues at VETS and UCT and so on, you are 15, 17 years late. We think that we need to get the basics right. All right? So part of the problems you have with the challenges you confront in higher education, universities mostly, are traceable to a poor basic education and training system. And we have noticed how there's, over the past 20 odd years, been a policy zigzag, lack of policy certainty. There's been various policy interventions, I don't know, 3 or 4 in the past 20 odd years. And policy experts will tell you that for a policy to settle, for you to really be able to interrogate its impact, you need to give it at least 10 years. We've been changing policies almost every 5 years in basic education. Well, the same could be said about the economy. Okay? So higher education, there are several challenges in higher education. One of them is that the country, the policymakers, our parents, our students, think that university constitutes post-schooling education. They think that your best option after school is going to university. Fees must fall, characterize the crisis as a university crisis rather than a post-schooling crisis. So we think that we need to take another look at how universities are viewed. But even in universities, in the past 20 odd years, we've spent a lot of money, gotten more black students into the system, but have focused less on issues like student housing, less on issues like safety, less on issues like curriculum changes, and making that curriculum more relevant to the needs of this country and this continent. And then the other area or thematic area we focused on is the TVET and the skill space, okay? I'm saying TVET and skill space because there's also something called the SETAs operating in the skill space. Now, much has been said about TVET earlier, but the critical point for us is that we've seen massive injections of funds in the past 10 years in TVETs, all right? And we've had quite a number of students going through the system, but the throughput rate has not been great. Secondly, the private sector, who really should be the beneficiaries of graduates from TVETs, still do not take these institutions as seriously as they should. Well, we think it shouldn't end there. We think what needs to happen, and our research from across the world suggests that for a vocational education and training system to succeed, you can't have educational experts sitting somewhere in a corner and drawing up curricula. You need to have the private sector right at the center of curriculum design, of running of these institutions, and making sure that you don't confuse TVETs with schools, because in many of our TVETs, you literally go and sit on a desk for 8 hours. It's no longer a TVET, it's a school, okay? In a TVET, we should ideally have our learners in overalls. 2 hours on the desk, 2 hours practical. And if you have the private sector, the various sectors of the economy, firmly embedded in each of the TVETs, you have a real good opportunity of getting these students working into jobs post-qualification. Because the private sector is familiar with them, because the private sector informs the curriculum, because the economy, ladies and gentlemen, is a tricky business these days. The machinery that the students are using to train over a 2 or 3 year period are no longer relevant when they graduate. So if you don't have the private sector plugged in, you are going to continue training our children with outdated equipment and machinery. When they get into the labor market, nobody wants to see them because, their skills are not updated. So the critical point we're making there, get the private sector at the heart of the TVET system if you want it to succeed. Secondly, fix the quality. Thirdly, get qualified, are they called lecturers or teachers? Qualified lecturers, okay? And just raise the profile of vocational education and training as a real alternative if you want to drive growth and really transform the labor market in the country. Now, related to that is the SETA system. I'm advised reliably that there's around 17 to 18 billion annually available to the SETA system. You will all agree with me that that is a massive amount of money by any measure, but you'll also agree with me that that 18 billion simply doesn't make the impact it should in terms of growing the skills that our sectors in our country needs. 21 SETAs, 21 bureaucracies, 21 processes, very little coordination and planning. We suspect that what you need to do if you want to insist on keeping the system is better coordination at the center. Okay, the department certainly doesn't have that capacity to coordinate. So all of these, for us, ladies and gentlemen, leads to transforming the labor market. So for us, it's a systematic and clever pipeline. Okay, it starts with ECD. It leads to transforming the labor market. Now, all research will tell you that we've made very little progress in transforming our labor market 20-odd years down the line. It remains largely the same. The continuities are unbelievable. So, you fix your labor market, you are able to play some role, make some kind of contribution to growing the economy and ensuring economic development. Now, I could go into the specific areas, but out of respect for you, Ashraf, I want to end here. Is that okay? Oh, I'm happy to continue. It's on. Oh, the mic. No, you don't need that for. Or you can just use the pulpit.
It's mine. Hello.
No. Oh, we can swap. Do you want us to swap? But
Thanks, okay. This is on. No, I don't. Okay. Sorry about that. Can you hear me? No. Or maybe I speak into it like this. I can also do that. It's fine, this is lighter. I'll take this off. Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm here representing the Economic Transformation Working Group. And in the interest of time, I'm going to go straight into what it is that I've been mandated to do. So in the spirit of redesigning, reimagining, and reorganizing the South African economy, what the Economic Transformation Working Group's been tasked with is to attempt to grapple with louder. Okay. Okay, I think that's better. Okay, so what the Economic Transformation Working Group's been tasked with is to really try and grapple with issues around the systemic exclusion and underrepresentation of the majority of South Africans in the economy, and particularly how this exclusion then translates into vicious cycles of debt and poverty. So I'm going to present to you just what has been discussed through a number of discussions and iterations with a number of stakeholders that have been involved in this process in the last couple of months. And I'll just give you an update on where it is that we are. And around the 7 key sub-themes that have emerged from those discussions. I also have to note that the topic by its very nature is quite complex and tends to cut across a lot of the other themes. So the topics that I'm going to present to you are by no means exhaustive, but rather themes that have emerged from collapsing a myriad of other topics that have come through the discussions that we've had in the past couple of months. And just a disclaimer, the views that I'm presenting are not my own. In my position as the moderator, I'm here to present the views of the collective. And we've made, I think, 2 key observations have emerged from the discussions, and 2 of those, I think I'm going to discuss those before I go into the sub-themes. And the one being that we can't talk meaningfully about economic transformation without the contextual understanding of the structure and composition of the South African economy, and how the system as it is, further entrenches poverty, inequality, and debt cycles, etc. And secondly, is that although things have changed, South Africa is still haunted by the effects of what Ben Fine and Rustamji coined as the minerals and energy complex. And by definition, they describe the mineral energy complex as the linkages between the extraction of raw minerals, the processing of raw minerals, and the coal-based production of power or electricity in the country. So, and how these capital-intensive industries have made it that much more difficult for broader economic participation. So just to hold those two, those observations in your head as I go through the sub-themes. So there's seven sub-themes, and the first one is around building and strengthening a carbon conscious or green economy, as what it is, it's more commonly known, that is really centered around the people and environmentally conscious as well. Being cognizant, obviously, of the threats of climate change and how real those threats are. Just the effects of the drought in Cape Town are really just a sneak preview of, climate change and the impacts of climate change. Hey? Lucky me. And again, our second sub-theme is really around clean energy and how the transition to renewable energy sources seems to present an opportunity for us to kickstart an economic dispensation that's a bit more inclusive, than the previously coal-based economy that we are currently in. And again, the role of the state, state pools of capital, and what role the state plays in actually facilitating inclusive economies, whether it's through economic and macroeconomic policy and industrialization policy. But again, it's around the crucial role of the state in helping us transcend our current economic malaise. And the financialization of the South African economy and the power and the control of the financial sector, and how the sector and the need for macroeconomic policies to address and facilitate the integration and absorption of currently discounted and even in some parts disregarded economic pursuits of the poorest in society, and issues around the financial markets, critical engagements with financial markets, the concepts of financial markets, asset inequalities, asset and income inequality. Also, the participation of youth and women in the economy, as my colleague Sihle said, again underpinned by an education system that aims to develop and groom able and skilled young people, especially with the advent of the fourth industrial revolution, which I would argue is here and not coming. And again, the issue around land use and spatial application, and looking at land as an economic enabler and a factor of production. And the last sub-theme is around regional economic integration and integrated planning across the SADC region. So, those are those are not exhaustive. We completely understand it's quite a complex topic. So the discussions, that's where we are in our thinking currently. And just to say in concluding that, there's absolutely, no one right solution for South Africa to transcend the status quo. But what is becoming increasingly clear is that the economy must and actually needs to be restructured to an investment-driven rather than finance and consumption-based economy. And these investments ought to be made in productive sectors that create value and provide opportunities for meaningful participation and ownership of the currently marginalized and excluded. And to say that if we don't engage critically with some of these arguably root causes of, where our economy is currently, is perhaps, what we may miss is the opportunity for us to really reimagine and redesign and fall into the trap of doing more of the same. And obviously undermine the South Africa that we pray for. Thank you.
So, can you hear me? You can hear me. Since September, when I found myself sort of leading this stream by accident, we have been trying to define what it is that we mean when we talk about healing. And there have been a series of workshops and there have been a series of engagements, and we've gotten closer. And it was a very big day on the 2nd of May this year when we managed to get Indigenous Knowledge Systems at a meeting in Kotso House with the Bishop onto the agenda underneath Healing and Reconciliation. Because it just so happens that human beings in Africa have been doing healing in its essential form for longer than human beings anywhere else on earth. And one of the texts, and this is not a textual thing, it's an experiential thing. To heal is to experience healing. But one of the texts that have informed this discussion is a book called The Healing Wisdom of Africa by Malidome Patrice Sommet, who is an international intellectual, has degrees from the Sorbonne and from NYU, but is an initiated traditional African healer from Burkina Faso. And he takes African indigenous wisdom into North America. He's allowed into North America with African indigenous wisdom because he just so happens to have the degrees that they need. But once there, he does real African healing. And this real African healing is based on a couple of fundamental ideas. Perhaps most fundamental is the idea that the individual heals the community and the community heals the individual. So for example, in an indigenous African system, you will not shame someone in public. Because to shame someone in public is to drop their self-esteem, and if their self-esteem is dropped, then the energetic levels of the entire community is dropped. So the shaming happens in a ritual space, in a safe ritual space. And bringing indigenous knowledge systems into the core of what we're doing in the healing and reconciliation theme has enabled us to move into more towards the healing itself as opposed to the diagnosing. Because we've done a lot of diagnosing in this group as well. So the original 4 themes we had was woundedness. If you have to be healed, if you're going to be healed, you have to admit that you're wounded. So woundedness was one of our original 4 themes. The second one was identity. South Africa, we appear to be the world champions of othering over here. Whether it's othering on gender lines, or othering on racial lines, or othering on religious lines. We've been talking about this all day, but we really are amongst the world's best at othering people. And the othering is connected to the wound, because you'll feel it's okay to wound an other. Then below that we had, and not in any specific order, we've been looking very deeply at justice for past atrocities. And at the convention at the Nelson Mandela Children's Center in May, we had Howard Varney, who was the advocate who was pivotal in bringing the Ahmed Timmel inquest back, and is pivotal in all of these apartheid-era political murder trials, presenting on the fact that the current South African government is simply not interested in bringing justice for past atrocities, and it seems to be because if you put apartheid-era generals on the stand, they might reveal what the ANC top brass did during the struggle. And these secrets are not to be revealed in public. So how can you have healing if you don't have justice? And how can you have healing if you're keeping secrets? And then the last one was that we managed to get on was indigenous knowledge systems. That's now been expanded. At the meeting in May, we decided that woundedness was not specific enough. And so we divided woundedness into gender. There needs to be a gender conversation in this country. There is simply no respect for the mother, no respect for the female. And it's obvious in our statistics, it's obvious in our patriarchy, it's obvious in our language. But the second aspect is also family brokenness. Our families are broken, which again feeds back into indigenous knowledge systems. In a community where the traditional healers are holding the space, the family isn't broken because the community is the family. And if something is broken, it's a quick indication that it needs to be healed. So those are the 5 themes that we're going to be focusing on tomorrow. But in ending, because I know I'm under time, I would very much like to read from an absolutely beautiful paper that Rutendo Ngara, who is a magnificent traditional healer and is one of my teachers and is a teacher to many, presented on the indigenous knowledge aspect. And I'm just, it was a half-an-hour paper, and I'm going to read from it for about 3 minutes. So, according to the ancient ones of Africa, and indeed the ancient ones across the globe, everything is a teacher. Knowledge lies everywhere, and in all things lies wisdom. But perhaps the greatest source of this wisdom is nature. By nature we mean a bit more than that which lies at the edge of the city, or the bushveld into which we may escape every now and then. We may describe nature as that which is untouched by human technology, the ecosystem, that which is natural. From an etymological point of view, we may borrow from the Latin natura, denoting birth, origin, natural constitution, or innate quality. Perhaps we could go into the ancient African roots from Kemet, or ancient Egypt, and speak of neter, which, due to the fact that the Kemetic hieroglyphic language did not record vowels, is often written as NTR. Many scholars translate NTR as God or gods, the divine force or the sustaining power, which was retained in the Coptic language as Nutar, finally rendering itself into common language as nature. But for many who practice the ancient ways of Kemet, Neter encompasses God and everything else. It is the creator, the created, and the uncreated, the being that synthesizes and pervades life in all realms. Neter, the undefined, formless nothingness, is at the same time the underlying factor of all objects in the world. Neter is all that is. And then to symbolize, to denote, to expound on this, Rutendo went into the metaphor of rivers. And rivers, she says, inasmuch as they are a part of nature, are one of the infinite manifestations of Neter. And if wisdom lies everywhere, what is the wisdom they seek to impart? The river Niger has an interesting story. Its source is the Guinea highlands, a mere 240 kilometers from the Atlantic Ocean. Yet instead of following the course of commonly understood logic, by traveling those 240 kilometers to the ocean which refuses no river, instead it moves inland in a northeasterly direction, deep into the interior of the Sahara Desert in Mali. And once in the desert, instead of following this course towards the Mediterranean Sea, it makes a surprising right turn near the city of Timbuktu, following a meandering journey through Niger, Benin, and Nigeria, eventually discharging into the Atlantic Ocean at the Gulf of Guinea. What would have been a 240-kilometer journey to the ocean instead becomes a sinuous, crescent-shaped 4,180 kilometers of river. As a consequence of this highly inefficient route, the Niger loses 2/3 of its potential flow to seepage and evaporation. Furthermore, along the way, the gradient drastically decreases, thus further reducing the flow potential and precipitating a very slow and sluggish trek towards the ocean. The result of this loss of potential is the formation of the Niger Delta, a series of braided streams, marshes, and lakes as large as Belgium. The Niger Delta is the largest wetland in Africa and the third largest in the world, with an ecosystem containing one of the highest concentrations of biodiversity on the planet. Apart from supporting abundant rainforests, flora, and fauna, it has large stretches of arable land that sustains a diverse agricultural system. It is home to more than 30 million people made up of 40 different ethnic groups. This delta, the result of an inefficient but effective river, is a wellspring of diversity and of nourishment. And the metaphor in that is the metaphor of indigenous knowledge systems. And common features that emerge from the various definitions of the knowledge of traditional and indigenous communities include that it has roots in a particular community, but is situated within a broader social context in which all life forms are a result of the interaction between social and spiritual relations. It is a tacit knowledge transmitted orally through initiation or by demonstration and observation. It is experiential rather than theoretical. It is inherently interlinked to the understanding of the environment, and it is dynamic and constantly adapting. And it is those principles that have been informing healing and reconciliation, and hopefully are going to inform them tomorrow.
10 minutes, exactly 10 minutes. Just making the points, Kevin. First of all, let's just give them all applause, all four of them. Thank you so much. Because it's not just what they've said. It's, as I can gather, this is the culmination, and there's more to come. So there's lots of work that they've done over a period of time. Now, maybe just time for 3 questions, because a lot of what they will talk about, or they've spoken about, will come up tomorrow. But let me just allow you 3 questions. Again, first hands first. If there's nothing because we want to have coffee, that's also fine. Seems like that. I'm not going to be, I'm like an auctioneer. It's done. Okay. So this is the plan then, right? In terms of those themes, and the 4 representing the themes, they'll be discussed extensively tomorrow. So tomorrow is very little about talking and presenting down. It's a lot about discussion, debating, input from all of you. So it's really, really important that your presence will be felt. I would think that's the nuts and bolts and the engine, really, in terms of why we are all here. In terms of today, there's still work to be done. You, just from a social media point of view, feel free to tweet all those thoughts that you've heard and your own opinions. Then I mentioned to you the live streaming that took place regarding the 4 subjects or the 4 themes. And may I suggest, ahead of tomorrow, you could actually well go home tonight and do some revision on those themes. Because you also need to then give your name, ideally today, in terms of which one of the themes, because they run concurrently, right? So you need to give your names in terms of which one of the 4 that you'd like to be a part of. So if you're uncertain, maybe there's a chance for you tomorrow, but whatever it is, because they're interlocked, I would strongly suggest you spend some time tonight, after supper, that is, which is here, to go through those themes, so you'll be very well prepared, because myself, having had the privilege of hosting those debates, the input was just absolutely terrific and really significant and important. Okay, let me tell you what else we're going to do. So we're going to have we're almost done. We're going to have the tea coffee break now, which will be over that side where we had lunch as well as when we met up in the morning. Then on the back of that, in the same place, there'll be this, let's call it the launch, the relaunch of that fabulous book called Dare Not Linger, The Presidential Years, put together by Nelson Mandela and Mandla Langa. We'll chat to Mandla. Mandla's around, so we'll talk to him as well about that. And that will come off the back of the actual tea, right? Thereafter, the next big thing for you is the supper, which is the dinner, which starts at 6 o'clock. And I think it's going to be happening here. So while we are over there, they'll be sorting out this whole area, and there'll be a complete change. Will they do it over there? Okay, so these curtains are certainly playing a role in disguising what's going on behind the scenes there. Okay, so let's just thank you guys once again. Thank you. I would suggest you may want to take pictures of the 4. Maybe we should just stand up and make sure that you guys are not missed there. Just get to the front there. Where's the photographers? You may want to just take the pictures of the 4 of them, right? And for the rest, well, you can take pictures too. Take pictures, tweet them. Otherwise, we then will break for coffee. Okay. Okay. The 4 wise, people. Perfect. Okay, thank you. Time for coffee. I would think 10, 15 minutes, and very immediately at the same place, we'll have that book launch with Mandla Lanka. Thank you. Fascinating about that river, eh? I'm going to read up about it. You should.